Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Officer Diego Martinez, and I've been patrolling the streets of Phoenix, Arizona for over 15 years. In all that time, I've seen plenty of things that would make most people lose sleep. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what my partner Andrew and I encountered on that cold February night in 2018. It was around 2:30 in the morning when the call came through our radio. Dispatch sent us to Maple Street, just 3 blocks from our current location. The neighbors had been calling emergency services for the past hour, reporting disturbing screams coming from what they described as an abandoned house. They insisted someone was being tortured inside, but none of them dared to investigate themselves. Andrew was driving that night, and I could see his knuckles turning white as he gripped the steering wheel. We'd both been on edge lately. There had been a string of home invasions in the area, and the department was putting extra pressure on us to patrol more aggressively. When we turned onto Maple Street, I immediately noticed several people standing on the sidewalk in their pajamas and robes. Despite the late hour, they'd all come out to witness whatever was happening. The moment they saw our patrol car, they started waving frantically, pointing toward a 2-story Victorian house that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. As we stepped out of the cruiser, I could hear it myself, a woman's scream, raw and desperate, echoing from somewhere inside the house. The sound made my blood run cold. I'd heard plenty of domestic disturbance calls, but this was different. This was primal terror. "Everyone needs to get back inside their homes," I called out to the gathered crowd. "If we need to discharge our weapons, this area isn't safe." Most of the neighbors complied, but I could see faces pressed against windows, watching our every move. Andrew and I approached the front door, which was hanging slightly off its hinges. The paint was peeling, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped with age. "Police, if there's anyone inside, come out with your hands visible," Andrew shouted, pounding on the door frame. "We're coming in." The only response was another blood-curdling scream that seemed to come from the second floor. Without hesitation, Andrew kicked the door, and it crashed inward, nearly falling off its remaining hinge. The smell hit us immediately, a mixture of mold, decay, and something else I couldn't identify. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a living room filled with broken furniture, scattered newspapers yellowed with age, and thick spider webs that draped from the ceiling like curtains. We moved through the first floor methodically, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. The kitchen had a hole in the floor where the linoleum had rotted through, and the wallpaper was peeling in long strips that rustled when we walked past. But there was no sign of any one victim or perpetrator. Then we heard it, a sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor directly above us. Andrew looked at me, and I nodded. We both drew our service weapons and headed for the staircase. The wooden steps creaked ominously under our weight as we climbed toward the second floor. Each step seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. When we reached the landing, our flashlights revealed a narrow hallway with 4 doorways leading to what had once been bedrooms. We searched each room systematically. The first was completely empty, except for a mattress that looked like it had been chewed by rodents. The second contained only a broken dresser with all its drawers pulled out and scattered across the floor. The third room was where we found it. In what must have been the master bedroom, someone had drawn a large pentagram on the hardwood floor, using what appeared to be dark red paint, though given the circumstances, I suspected it wasn't paint at all. The walls were covered in symbols and writing in a language neither Andrew nor I could identify. Some of the markings looked fresh, while others seemed to have been there for months or even years. "Jesus Christ," Andrew whispered, lowering his flashlight. "What kind of sick bastards were using this place?" We immediately called for backup and sealed off the house. The crime scene investigators would need to document everything, and we'd need to canvass the neighborhood more thoroughly. But as we waited for additional units to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. During our interviews with the neighbors, we learned that the house had been abandoned for nearly 3 years after the elderly owner died. But several residents reported seeing groups of people entering through a back window during the early morning hours, usually between midnight and dawn. They described seeing flickering candlelight through the boarded-up windows and occasionally hearing chanting or music. Mrs. Henderson, who lived directly across the street, told us she'd called the police twice before about suspicious activity at the house. Both times, officers had checked the property and found nothing. She said the screaming had started around 1 o'clock that morning and continued intermittently until we arrived. "I was afraid they were killing someone in there," she said, wrapping her bathrobe tighter around herself. "It sounded like a woman in agony. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. We never found any evidence of who had been screaming. There were no signs of forced entry beyond our own, no blood, no indication that anyone had been in that house recently, except for the ritual markings upstairs. The forensics team confirmed that the symbols on the walls contained human blood, but it was too degraded to provide DNA matches. 2 weeks later, the city demolished the house. The official reason was structural instability, but I suspect the real reason was that nobody wanted to deal with whatever had been happening there. The lot remains empty to this day, just an overgrown patch of weeds where that Victorian nightmare used to stand. I've developed my own theory about what happened that night. Based on what the neighbors told us about the late-night visitors and the ritualistic setup we found upstairs, I believe some kind of occult group had been using the house for ceremonies. Whether they were summoning something or just playing with forces they didn't understand, I can't say. But I'm convinced that what we heard that night wasn't entirely human. Andrew transferred to a different precinct 6 months later. He never said it was because of that night, but I know it was. Some experiences change you, mark you in ways that don't wash off with time. And sometimes, when I'm driving past that empty lot during my late-night patrols, I swear I can still hear echoes of those screams carried on the desert wind. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I can't use my real name for this story, so just call me Officer Martinez. I've been a cop in El Paso, Texas for 8 years now, and I've seen things that would make most people question their sanity. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that fog-covered night in November of 2019. My partner Rodriguez and I were cruising through the residential district around 12:30 in the morning when we got the emergency call. A child was requesting help from her home address, saying her mother was having problems. But the dispatcher couldn't get more details because the girl was too young to explain clearly what was happening. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly that evening, and a thick fog had rolled in from the desert, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. Street lights looked like glowing orbs floating in the mist, and visibility was down to maybe 20 feet. Even Rodriguez, who usually joked around during our shifts, was unusually quiet as we navigated through the haze. When we arrived at the address, a modest single-story house on Elm Street, I immediately noticed something was off. All the lights in the house were on, but the curtains were drawn tight. The front yard was well maintained, with a small garden and a child's bicycle lying on its side near the porch steps. I knocked on the door while Rodriguez positioned himself to the side, hand resting on his weapon. After a few moments, the door opened to reveal a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She had long dark hair and was wearing pink pajamas with cartoon characters on them. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and she kept glancing nervously toward the hallway behind her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I asked, crouching down to her eye level. "What's happening with your mommy?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. "Mommy's locked in her room and she's screaming really loud. There's someone else in there with her, but they sound scary." Rodriguez and I exchanged glances. This sounded like a domestic violence situation, possibly with an intruder. We immediately went into tactical mode, drawing our weapons and asking the little girl to stay by the front door. "Where's your mommy's room?" I asked. She pointed down the hallway toward the back of the house. "It's the last door, but it's locked and she won't come out." As we moved through the house, I could hear it loud banging sounds like someone was hitting the walls with tremendous force, followed by a woman's voice screaming, "Get away from me. Please, just leave me alone." The sounds were coming from behind a closed bedroom door at the end of the hall. Rodriguez positioned himself on one side while I took the other. The banging was getting more violent, and the woman's screams were becoming more desperate and terrified. "This is the police," Rodriguez shouted through the door. "Whoever's in there, open the door immediately or we're coming in." Suddenly, everything went completely silent. The banging stopped, the screaming stopped. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Rodriguez and I waited a few seconds, then he tried the door handle. It was unlocked. I kicked the door open while Rodriguez covered me, both of us ready for whatever violent scene we might find inside. But what we discovered defied all logic and training. The woman was huddled in the corner of the room, pressed against the wall with a look of absolute terror on her face. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes were torn, and she had scratches on her arms. But she was completely alone. There was no one else in the room. The bedroom wasn't large, maybe 12 by 14 feet, with a double bed, a dresser, and a small closet. There was only one window, and it was still locked from the inside with security bars on the outside. No one could have escaped through there. "Ma'am, are you injured?" I asked, holstering my weapon and approaching slowly. "Where's the person who was in here with you?" She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, and said something that chilled me to the bone. "You need to leave. You need to get out of here right now, or you'll end up somewhere terrible." Rodriguez searched the closet and under the bed while I tried to calm the woman down. She kept insisting that we had to leave immediately, becoming more agitated and frantic with each passing moment. I started to wonder if she was under the influence of drugs or having some kind of psychotic episode. That's when we heard the front door slam shut with tremendous force, followed by the little girl's scream from the living room. We rushed back toward the front of the house to find the child cowering under the coffee table, sobbing uncontrollably. I tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something was pushing against it from the other side with incredible strength, though I could see through the window that nothing was there. The woman had followed us and was now standing at the bottom of the stairs, completely hysterical. "I told you," she screamed. "I told you to leave. It's too late now, he's here." "Who's here?" Rodriguez demanded. "Who are you talking about?" "The shadow man," she said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "He's been coming here every night since Marcus started bringing those books home." The temperature in the house suddenly plummeted. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air, and the little girl's dog in the backyard started howling like it was in pain. But the most unsettling thing was the sound that came next: footsteps on the staircase. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone wearing boots, slowly descending the stairs one at a time. But these weren't normal footsteps. They had a strange, metallic quality to them, almost like hooves on concrete. Rodriguez and I both turned toward the staircase with our weapons drawn, shouting warnings. But no one was there. The steps continued, methodical and patient, growing louder as whatever was making them got closer to the bottom. The woman was screaming and covering her ears. The little girl was crying under the table, and even Rodriguez looked like he was about to lose it. We're trained to handle dangerous situations, but this was beyond anything they'd prepared us for at the academy. When the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, they suddenly stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the sound of our own heavy breathing. Then something grabbed the woman by her ankles and dragged her up the stairs so fast that neither Rodriguez nor I could react in time. Rodriguez fired a warning shot into the air out of pure shock, and I lunged forward trying to grab the woman's hands. But whatever had her was impossibly strong and quick. We could hear her head hitting each step as she was pulled upward, her screams echoing through the house. We ran up the stairs after her, but by the time we reached the top, the bedroom door had slammed shut and locked itself. We could hear the woman screaming inside, but there were other sounds too, growling, like some kind of animal, and crashes as furniture was being thrown around. Rodriguez shot the lock off the door, but even with the lock destroyed, the door wouldn't open. It was like something massive was braced against it from the inside. The woman's screams were getting weaker, and the animal sounds were getting louder. The power went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I tried to radio for backup, but my radio was just producing static. That's when Rodriguez and I finally accepted that we were dealing with something that our guns and training couldn't help us with. I ran back downstairs to check on the little girl, but she wasn't under the table anymore. I searched the entire living room with my flashlight, but couldn't find her anywhere. The house was completely dark and silent, except for the sounds coming from upstairs. When I turned my flashlight toward the kitchen, I froze. The little girl was standing in the middle of the room, but she wasn't crying anymore. She was smiling, a cold, adult smile that didn't belong on a child's face. Her eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's. Something was wrong with her. The energy in the room felt malevolent and oppressive. Without understanding why, I knew that whatever had been upstairs with her mother was now inside the little girl. Rodriguez came downstairs and started to approach her, but I grabbed his arm. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct I had was screaming danger. The child started walking toward us slowly, maintaining that unnatural smile, her head tilted slightly to one side. We backed toward the front door, and Rodriguez tried the handle again. This time it opened easily. As we stepped outside, I heard those same heavy footsteps coming down the stairs again. The little girl stopped walking and turned toward the staircase. In the darkness, our flashlight beams caught a glimpse of something that I still can't fully process. What looked like a massive hand with fingers that were too long, and joints that bent the wrong way, reaching down and taking the child's hand. We ran to our patrol car and immediately called for backup and an ambulance. Within minutes, 3 more units arrived along with paramedics. But when they entered the house with floodlights, they found only one thing: the woman's body in the upstairs bedroom. The little girl was never found. I learned later that the woman's boyfriend Marcus had been involved with a group that practiced ritual magic. According to the woman's sister, he'd been bringing home books about summoning and communicating with entities from other dimensions. The woman had tried to get him to stop, but he'd become obsessed with the idea of gaining power and wealth through supernatural means. The case officially remains unsolved. The little girl is still listed as missing, and Marcus disappeared 2 days before the incident. But I know what I saw that night. I know that something evil had taken control of that child, and I know that it wasn't human. I've been in therapy for 2 years now, but I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about that smile on the little girl's face. Rodriguez transferred to a desk job 6 months later. Neither of us talks about what happened, but I know he remembers every detail just like I do. Some things are too dark to forget, and some cases never really close. They just follow you home and wait in the shadows until you're alone with your thoughts in the middle of the night. I'm now retired from the force, but during my 30-year career as a police officer in Sacramento, California, I encountered things that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. This particular incident happened in 2008, and it's something I've never spoken about publicly until now. It was a Tuesday night in early March, and my partner Steve and I were working the graveyard shift, no pun intended. The night had been unusually quiet for a weeknight. Most of our calls had been routine. A few drunk and disorderly situations, a minor fender bender on Highway 99, and a noise complaint from an apartment complex on the south side. Around 3 in the morning, we received a call from dispatch requesting our immediate presence at Riverside Memorial Cemetery. The security guard had contacted emergency services, reporting vandalism and requesting police assistance. He'd mentioned something about grave disturbance, but hadn't provided many details over the radio. Riverside Memorial is one of the oldest cemeteries in Sacramento, established in 1874. It's a sprawling 100-acre property with elaborate Victorian-era monuments, ancient oak trees, and sections that date back to the gold rush era. During the day, it's actually quite beautiful and peaceful. At night, however, it takes on an entirely different character. When we arrived, we found Harold Winters, the night security guard, waiting for us near the main entrance. Harold was a man in his mid-50s who'd been working cemetery security for over a decade. I'd met him a few times before during routine checks, and he'd always struck me as steady and reliable, not the type to panic or exaggerate. But that night, Harold looked genuinely shaken. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by nervous energy, and his hands were trembling slightly as he lit his third cigarette since we'd arrived. "Officers, thank God you're here," he said, taking a long drag. "I've never seen anything like this in all my years working these grounds." "What exactly happened, Harold?" Steve asked, pulling out his notepad. Harold explained that around 2:15, he'd heard sounds coming from the older section of the cemetery, what locals called Pioneer's Rest. He described hearing what sounded like digging, along with voices, though he couldn't make out what they were saying from his security station near the front gate. "I grabbed my flashlight and headed over to investigate," he continued. "As I got closer, I could see two figures moving around near the Thornfield plot. That's where they buried young Timothy Thornfield last Thursday. But when these people saw my light, they ran. And I mean they ran fast, officer. Faster than anyone should be able to run across uneven ground in the dark." Steve and I followed Harold deeper into the cemetery, our flashlights cutting through the darkness between the headstones and monuments. The March air was cold and still, with a thin fog beginning to form near the ground. Our footsteps echoed strangely among the granite markers, creating an unsettling symphony of sound. When we reached the Thornfield plot, what we found made my stomach turn. The fresh grave had been completely excavated, with dirt piled in neat mounds around the perimeter. The coffin was partially visible, and the lid had been pried open. But what horrified us most was the condition of the body. Timothy Thornfield had been a 26-year-old construction worker who died in an industrial accident. He'd been buried with his body intact, according to the funeral home records. But what we found in that coffin was a corpse missing both arms and both legs. The extremities hadn't been cut off with tools. They appeared to have been torn away with tremendous force. "Jesus Christ," Steve whispered, taking several steps back from the grave. "Who would do something like this?" Harold was standing behind us, and I could hear him muttering prayers under his breath. "I've seen a lot of strange things working nights in a cemetery," he said, "but this is beyond anything human." We immediately called for backup and the coroner's office, then began searching the cemetery for any signs of the perpetrators. Harold led us toward the section where he'd last seen the figures running, an area filled with elaborate mausoleums and larger monuments that provided plenty of hiding places. The cemetery covered a vast area, and many sections were poorly lit. Ancient oak trees created deep shadows that seemed to shift and move as our flashlight beams passed over them. The fog was getting thicker, reducing our visibility to maybe 15 or 20 feet in some areas. We were searching near a cluster of mausoleums when we heard it low, feminine laughter coming from somewhere above us. Steve and I both froze, listening intently. The sound was coming from a massive oak tree that stood between two family crypts. I directed my flashlight up into the branches, scanning slowly from trunk to crown. At first, I saw nothing but leaves and shadows. But then my beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Sitting on a thick branch about 20 feet up was an elderly woman. She was wearing what looked like a tattered dress, and her long gray hair hung down around her face. But what made the sight truly horrifying was what she was holding a human arm, which she was biting and tearing at like some kind of wild animal. The moment my light hit her, she looked directly at us and laughed again, a sound that was part amusement and part madness. Then, with movements that seemed impossible for someone her age, she leaped from branch to branch like a spider, climbing higher into the tree. Steve was frozen in place, his flashlight beam wavering as his hands shook. "What the hell is that thing?" he managed to say. Before I could answer, the branches above us began thrashing violently, as if caught in a windstorm. But there was no wind that night. Leaves and small twigs rained down on us as something large moved through the upper canopy. Then we saw it, a massive bird, easily 6 feet across, launched itself from the tree and disappeared into the darkness. "Did you see that?" I asked Steve, but he was still staring up at the tree in shock. I grabbed a low branch and hauled myself up, determined to confirm what we'd witnessed. I climbed as high as I dared, searching every branch with my flashlight, but the tree was empty. Whatever had been up there was gone, leaving only scattered leaves and a few drops of what looked like blood on the bark. When I climbed back down, Steve helped me search the ground around the tree. We found several more human bones scattered in the grass, along with what appeared to be claw marks in the earth. But there was no sign of the woman or any explanation for what we'd witnessed. Harold was waiting for us when we returned to the cemetery entrance. When we described what we'd seen, his reaction surprised me. Instead of disbelief or shock, he simply nodded gravely. "This isn't the first time," he admitted. "I've seen those two before, always together, always in the early morning hours. They laugh and call out to me because they know I can't catch them. When I get close, they run into the darkness, and then I see them flying away as birds." He went on to explain that he'd witnessed similar incidents at least 6 times over the past 2 years, but he'd never reported them because he knew no one would believe him. He'd seen the women, or whatever they were, digging up graves and removing body parts, always targeting recent burials. "I've been hoping someone else would see them," Harold said. "I was beginning to think I was losing my mind." When our backup arrived, we filed a report describing the grave desecration and the theft of human remains. But we couldn't bring ourselves to include the more supernatural elements of our encounter. Who would believe that we'd seen an elderly woman eating human flesh in a tree before transforming into a giant bird? The investigation went nowhere. The official report listed the incident as grave robbing committed by unknown perpetrators who had somehow escaped on foot. The missing body parts were never recovered, and no suspects were ever identified. But here's what bothers me most about that night. We failed Harold. We left him to continue working alone in that cemetery, night after night, knowing that those things were still out there. I gave him my personal phone number and told him to call if he ever saw them again, but he never did. 3 months later, Harold quit his job without notice. The cemetery management told us he'd simply stopped showing up for work and never returned their calls. When we went to his apartment to check on him, we found it empty. His neighbors said he'd moved out suddenly in the middle of the night, without telling anyone where he was going. I've driven past Riverside Memorial countless times since then, and I always wondered what became of Harold and whether those creatures are still prowling the grounds after dark. The cemetery hired a new security guard, but I heard through the grapevine that the position has high turnover. Most guards don't last more than a few months. Sometimes I think about going back there late at night, just to see if those things are still around. But then, I remember the sound of that woman's laughter and the sight of her tearing flesh from a human bone, and I decide that some mysteries are better left unsolved. After 30 years of police work, I've learned that there are forces in this world that exist beyond our understanding, beyond our ability to control or explain. And sometimes, the best thing a smart cop can do is simply walk away and hope those forces don't follow you home. I've been retired from the Houston Police Department for over 5 years now, but there's one case that still haunts my dreams. It happened on a stormy October night in 2017, and it involved a level of evil that I never thought could exist in this world. My partner at the time was Officer Lisa Chen, and we'd been working together for 3 years. Lisa was one of the most capable officers I'd ever known, sharp, fearless, and completely dedicated to protecting the innocent. What happened that night changed both of us in ways that can never be undone. We just finished our dinner break around 11 p.m. when the emergency call came through. A woman was requesting immediate police and ambulance assistance at her home on Oakwood Drive. The dispatcher told us the caller was extremely distraught, crying so hard that the operator could barely understand her. All they could determine was that a child had been seriously injured. The storm that night was vicious, one of those Texas thunderstorms that makes you feel like the world is ending. Lightning was striking constantly, illuminating the sky in brilliant flashes, and the rain was coming down so hard that our windshield wipers could barely keep up. The thunder was so loud and frequent that it felt like artillery fire. When we arrived at the address, I immediately noticed that every light in the house was on, blazing against the storm-darkened night. It was a modest 2-story home in a working-class neighborhood, with a small front yard and a white picket fence that was rattling in the wind. Lisa knocked on the front door while I covered her from the side. After a few moments, the door flew open to reveal a woman in her mid-30s with terror written across her face. She was covered in what I immediately recognized as blood on her hands, her clothes even streaked across her cheek. "Please help us," she screamed over the thunder. "Please, you have to save him." We rushed into the house and found ourselves in a living room that looked like a crime scene. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, was lying unconscious on the carpet. Without going into graphic detail, I can tell you that he'd been severely injured in a way that suggested extreme violence. The paramedics arrived within minutes and immediately began working on him. But I could see in their faces that the situation was critical. While the EMTs worked, Lisa and I questioned the woman, who told us she was the children's aunt. Her name was Rebecca Torres, and she explained that she'd come to babysit her nephew and niece while their mother worked the night shift at a local diner. I walked into the house and found Marina standing over Carlos with a kitchen knife, Rebecca said, her voice shaking with shock and disbelief. She was hurting him, and she was smiling. I've never seen her smile like that. It wasn't her face, It was like someone else was wearing her skin. The paramedics informed us that Carlos had not survived his injuries. Rebecca collapsed into hysterical sobbing, while Lisa and I processed the horrific reality of what we were dealing with. An 11-year-old girl had apparently killed her younger brother. "Where is Marina now?" I asked Rebecca once she'd composed herself enough to speak. "Upstairs in her room," she whispered. She ran up there and locked the door after I started screaming. I was too afraid to follow her. Lisa and I exchanged glances. In all our years of police work, neither of us had ever dealt with a case involving such a young perpetrator committing such a violent crime. We climbed the stairs slowly, our hands resting on our weapons, though we both hoped we wouldn't need them against a child. The upstairs hallway was dimly lit, with 4 doors leading to different rooms. 3 were open, but one at the end of the hall was closed. Lisa approached the door and knocked gently. "Marina, this is Officer Chen with the Houston Police. I need you to open the door so we can talk." There was no response from inside the room. Lisa knocked again and spoke in the most reassuring voice she could manage, explaining that we just wanted to make sure Marina was safe and that no one was going to hurt her. That's when we heard laughter coming from behind the door. But it wasn't the giggle of an 11-year-old girl. It was deep, adult male laughter that sent chills down my spine. "That's not possible," Lisa whispered to me. "There's no man up here." We tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Lisa pushed it open slowly while I prepared to back her up. What we found inside that room challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. Marina was sitting in the far corner, underneath a rack of clothes hanging in her closet. She was staring directly at us with the most unsettling smile I've ever seen on a child's face. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and there was something ancient and malevolent in her expression. "Are you okay, honey?" Lisa asked, stepping carefully into the room. "Is there anyone else in here with you?" The girl didn't respond with words. She just continued staring at us with that horrible smile. I searched the entire room thoroughly. It was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a single window that had security bars and no possible way for anyone to escape. There was no television, no radio, no phone, nothing that could have produced that male laughter. When Lisa approached Marina, the girl suddenly jumped up and tried to run toward the door. It took both of us to restrain her safely, and throughout the struggle, she was screaming and fighting with a strength that seemed impossible for someone her size. We found the kitchen knife under her bed, along with evidence that confirmed Rebecca's account of what had happened. The most disturbing part came when we questioned Marina about what she'd done. She confessed immediately, but her explanation was something that none of us were prepared for. "He made me do it," she said in a flat, emotionless voice. "The shadow man told me I had to." We arranged for Marina to be evaluated by police psychologists and child services. The testing revealed something that shocked everyone involved. Marina showed no signs of mental illness, developmental disorders, or psychological trauma that would explain her actions. By all measures, she was a normal, healthy 11-year-old girl. During the investigation, we learned more about the family's background from Rebecca and Marina's mother, Carmen. Carmen had recently started dating a man named Marcus Rivera, who claimed to be involved in what he called spiritual consulting. According to Rebecca, Marcus had been bringing strange books and objects into the house, and convincing Carmen to participate in late-night rituals. Carmen was desperate, Rebecca told us during a follow-up interview. She was working 2 jobs just to pay rent, and Marcus promised her that his spiritual practices could bring them wealth and success. She was vulnerable, and he took advantage of that. Rebecca described how Marina's behavior had changed dramatically since Marcus entered their lives. The previously sweet and well-behaved girl had become aggressive, using profanity and having violent outbursts. Several times, Rebecca had found Marina talking to someone in her room, but when she investigated, no one else was there. The house itself had become a place of strange occurrences. Dishes would fall from kitchen cabinets in the middle of the night. Unexplained sounds echoed through the walls, and both children complained of seeing shadow people in their bedrooms. When we searched the house more thoroughly, we discovered Marcus's collection of books on ritual magic, several homemade dolls stuck with pins, and evidence of ceremonies that had been conducted in the basement. We also found a journal where Marcus had documented his attempts to open doorways and invite entities into the home. Carmen was arrested and charged with child endangerment, but she was released pending trial. Marcus had disappeared 3 days before the incident, and despite a statewide manhunt, he was never found. Marina was placed in protective custody at a juvenile facility. But here's what still keeps me awake at night. Lisa and I both witnessed that child produce a deep male laugh that seemed to come from inside her throat. We heard it with our own ears, and there's no rational explanation for how an 11-year-old girl could make that sound. During one of Marina's psychological evaluations, something happened that convinced me we were dealing with forces beyond human understanding. The psychiatrist, Dr. Sarah Kellerman, was conducting a session when Marina suddenly began speaking in a voice that wasn't her own, the same deep male voice Lisa and I had heard in her bedroom. She was the perfect vessel, the voice said through Marina's mouth. Young souls are so easy to influence, so malleable. The rituals opened the door, and I simply walked through. Dr. Kellerman immediately ended the session and called for additional security. When I interviewed her later, she admitted that in 20 years of child psychology, she'd never encountered anything like it. That wasn't multiple personality disorder or any recognized mental condition, she told me. That child was speaking in a voice that came from somewhere else entirely. The case officially closed when Marina was committed to a secure juvenile psychiatric facility. The official reports cited severe psychological trauma and potential substance exposure as contributing factors to her violent behavior. But those of us who witnessed what really happened know the truth is far more disturbing. I visited Marina once at the facility, about 6 months after the incident. She seemed like a normal child again, quiet, remorseful, and genuinely confused about what had happened that night. When I asked her about the shadow man she'd mentioned, she looked at me with innocent eyes and said she didn't remember saying that. I have bad dreams sometimes, she told me. Dreams about a tall man with no face who whispers things to me, but they're just dreams, right? I wanted to tell her yes, that they were just dreams. But looking into her eyes, I could see a flicker of something dark still lurking beneath the surface. Whatever had influenced her to commit that horrible act might have retreated, but I don't think it ever completely left. Lisa transferred to the robbery division after this case. She told me She couldn't handle crimes involving children anymore, but I knew the real reason. We'd both seen something that night that challenged our understanding of good and evil, of what's possible in this world. Marcus Rivera was never found, despite extensive investigations by multiple law enforcement agencies. His background check revealed a history of involvement with various occult groups across 3 states, and a pattern of targeting vulnerable single mothers with promises of supernatural solutions to their problems. Carmen Torres died in a car accident 8 months later. The official cause was driver fatigue, but I've always wondered if her guilt and trauma contributed to her death. She'd been attending therapy and trying to rebuild her life, but the weight of what happened to her children seemed to crush her spirit. This case taught me that evil isn't always what we expect it to be. Sometimes it wears the face of a helpful stranger, offering easy answers to desperate people. Sometimes it hides behind promises of power and prosperity. And sometimes it uses the most innocent among us as instruments of darkness. I've been retired for 5 years now, but I still think about Marina Torres. She would be 16 years old today, and I wonder if she's found peace or if that shadow man still visits her dreams. I wonder if Dr. Kellerman was right, and something from another realm briefly took control of that child's soul. Most of all, I wonder how many other Marcus Riveras are out there, preying on desperate families and opening doors to things that should remain closed. Because after what I witnessed that stormy October night, I know that there are forces in this world that exist beyond our laws, beyond our weapons, and beyond our ability to protect the innocent from their influence. My name is Manuel Santos, and I recently retired after 25 years with the Tucson Police Department. During my career, I worked everything from traffic stops to homicide investigations, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced during my rookie year back in 2003. I was fresh out of the academy, still learning the ropes and trying to prove myself worthy of the badge. My training officer was Sergeant Patricia Martinez, a 15-year veteran who'd seen it all and had a reputation for being tough but fair with new recruits. The call came in during our night shift patrol on a Thursday in late September. Dispatch had received a strange emergency call. Someone had been crying and moaning on the line for over a minute, but they couldn't get any coherent information from the caller. The phone number traced back to a residence on Desert Vista Road, way out on the eastern edge of our jurisdiction, where the city meets the Sonoran Desert. Probably a medical emergency, Sergeant Martinez said as we drove toward the address. Could be someone having a stroke or heart attack who can't communicate properly. The house was isolated, sitting on about 2 acres of desert property, with the nearest neighbor at least half a mile away. It was a single-story ranch-style home with a large front yard filled with desert landscaping, saguaro cacti, ocotillo, and various types of agave plants. But what immediately caught my attention was the dozen or so cats scattered around the property, all of them yowling and pacing nervously. "That's a lot of cats," I observed as we pulled into the gravel driveway. "Desert people tend to collect strays," Martinez replied. Nothing unusual about that. But as we approached the front door, the cats' behavior became more agitated. They were all focused on the house, their ears flattened back and their tails bristled with fear. A few of them ran away as we walked past, while others continued their anxious crying. The front yard showed signs of neglect. The desert plants were overgrown, and there was a general sense that no one had maintained the property in months. Several potted plants near the front door had died and turned brown in their containers. Martinez knocked on the door and announced our presence. Tucson Police. We received an emergency call from this address. Is anyone home? No response came from inside the house, so she knocked again, louder this time. If someone needs medical assistance, please respond or we'll have to enter the premises. That's when we saw movement at the front window. The curtains parted slightly, and an elderly woman peered out at us. She appeared to be in her 70s, with long white hair and deeply wrinkled skin. She was wearing what looked like a faded nightgown, and her expression was distinctly unfriendly. "Ma'am, did you call 911? Martinez called out to her. "We're here to help if you need assistance." The woman stared at us for several more seconds, then let the curtain fall back into place. She didn't acknowledge our presence or indicate whether she needed help. "Well, that was weird," I muttered. "Let's give it another minute," Martinez said. Sometimes elderly people are suspicious of strangers, even police. We waited by the front door, but the woman never returned to the window or responded to our continued knocking. That's when we heard the sounds coming from inside the house, strange, guttural noises that definitely weren't human. They sounded like wounded animals crying out in pain. All the cats in the yard suddenly bolted, running away from the house as fast as they could move across the desert terrain. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively placed my hand on my service weapon. "Something's not right here," Martinez said, drawing her gun. "Those sounds, that's not normal." She tried the front door and found it unlocked. "We're coming in," she shouted as she pushed the door open. The smell hit us immediately, a combination of decay, unwashed bodies, and something else I couldn't identify. The house was completely dark except for the light from our flashlights, and it was clear that no one had been maintaining the property. Dust covered every surface, and there was debris scattered across the floors. We searched the house room by room, calling out to see if anyone needed assistance. The place felt abandoned, with old furniture covered in dust and no signs of recent habitation. The kitchen had dirty dishes piled in the sink that looked like they'd been there for weeks. But it was the bathroom where we made the discovery that changed everything. In the bathtub, we found human skeletal remains. The bones were completely clean of flesh and appeared to have been there for quite some time. The sight of them made my rookie stomach turn, and I had to step outside for a moment to compose myself. Martinez immediately called for backup and the coroner's office, then secured the scene. While we waited for additional units to arrive, neighbors from the surrounding properties began showing up, drawn by the police cars and flashing lights. That's when we learned the truth about the woman we'd seen at the window. "Nobody's lived in that house for over 6 months," said Dorothy Chen, who lived about a quarter-mile down the road. "Mrs. Esther Valdez used to live there, but she died last winter. Heart attack, I think. The house has been empty ever since." Martinez and I exchanged glances. "Ma'am, are you certain about that?" I asked. "We definitely saw an elderly woman inside just a few minutes ago." Dorothy shook her head firmly. "That's impossible, officer. Esther had no family, and the house has been sealed up since she passed." The only time anyone goes near the place is when animal control comes by to deal with all her cats. She must have had 30 or 40 of them. Another neighbor, Robert Kim, joined the conversation. Dorothy's right. Esther was known around here as the Cat Lady. People said she practiced some kind of folk magic or witchcraft, but I always figured that was just gossip. After she died, strange things started happening around that property. What kind of strange things? Martinez asked. Lights in the windows at night, even though there's no electricity, Robert explained. People have reported seeing someone moving around inside the house, but whenever anyone checks, it's always empty. And the cats. They used to love that place when Esther was alive, but now they won't go near it. The coroner arrived and confirmed that the skeletal remains belonged to an elderly female who had died of natural causes, most likely several months earlier. Based on dental records and personal effects found in the house, the remains were identified as Esther Valdez. But here's the part that still haunts me. If Esther Valdez had been dead for 6 months, who was the woman Martinez and I saw at the window? Who had been living in that house with her decomposing body? And who had made that emergency call? The phone company confirmed that the call had indeed originated from the landline inside the house, but there was no active service to that address. The line had been disconnected shortly after Esther's death, when the bills stopped being paid. We found Esther's personal belongings scattered throughout the house, including books on folk remedies, herb cultivation, and what appeared to be journals documenting various rituals and spells. The neighbors' stories about her practicing some form of witchcraft seemed to have some basis in reality. Maybe she's still here, Martinez said quietly as we finished processing the scene. Maybe she's been trying to call for help, to get someone to find her body and give her a proper burial. It was an unsettling thought, but it was the only explanation that made any sense. The woman we'd seen at the window had looked exactly like the photographs of Esther Valdez we'd found in the house. The same white hair, the same facial features, even the same nightgown she'd been wearing when she died. The house was eventually cleaned out and put up for sale, but it remained empty for years. Real estate agents reported strange occurrences during showings, doors opening and closing on their own, the sound of cats meowing when no animals were present, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Esther Valdez was finally laid to rest in a small ceremony attended by a few neighbors and some distant relatives who were located through public records. After the burial, the strange reports from the house seemed to stop, and it was eventually sold to a young family who renovated it completely. But I still drive past that property sometimes during my patrol routes, and I think about the woman at the window. Was it really Esther's spirit, trapped in that house with her own remains? Was she the one who called for help, hoping someone would finally find her and give her peace? I've come to believe that some people leave such a strong imprint on a place that death doesn't immediately release them. Esther Valdez had lived in that desert house for over 20 years, caring for countless stray cats and living a solitary life connected to the natural world around her. Maybe her love for that place and those animals was so strong that her spirit couldn't move on until someone discovered her body and treated it with dignity. Maybe she'd been waiting months for someone to answer her call for help, appearing at the window night after night, until finally, 2 police officers showed up to investigate. Martinez retired 5 years ago, but we still talk about that case occasionally. Neither of us has ever come up with a rational explanation for what we experienced that night. We saw a dead woman at her own window, in the house where she died alone and remained undiscovered for months. It taught me that police work isn't just about dealing with the living. Sometimes we're called to help souls who can't rest, who need someone to bear witness to their story and ensure they're not forgotten. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is simply listen when the dead are trying to tell us something. My name is Roland, and I spent 23 years as a state trooper in the mountain regions of Colorado before I retired. During those years, I witnessed things that would make most people question their sanity. But there's one incident that still haunts me decades later. This happened back in the winter of 1994, when I was assigned to patrol the remote stretches of Highway 91 that cuts through the Rockies. It was a lonely assignment, just me and my cruiser for hours at a time, covering nearly 100 miles of winding mountain road. The other troopers and I would cross paths occasionally, and those brief encounters were always welcome, especially during the long winter nights when the darkness seemed to swallow everything whole. That particular night, I remember like it was yesterday. The temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees, and a thick blanket of snow covered everything. I was nursing a thermos of hot coffee I'd picked up at a 24-hour diner in Leadville, trying to stay warm as I made my rounds. The roads were nearly deserted. I'd gone almost 2 hours without seeing another vehicle, which wasn't unusual for that stretch during a blizzard. I was driving through one of the most isolated sections, surrounded by towering pines and steep ravines, when I spotted something that made me slam on my brakes. Through the swirling snow, I could see a car sitting diagonally across both lanes, completely blocking the road. The passenger door was wide open, and the headlights were still on, cutting through the darkness like beacons. I pulled over and grabbed my flashlight, thinking I was about to deal with an accident or breakdown. But as I approached the vehicle, a late-model sedan that looked to be in perfect condition, something felt wrong. The engine was still running, keys dangling from the ignition, and strange, haunting music was playing from the radio. It sounded almost like chanting, but in a language I'd never heard before. I called out, but there was no response. The car was completely empty. My first priority was getting the vehicle off the road before someone came around that blind curve and slammed into it. I slid behind the wheel, moved the car to the shoulder, and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the wind howling through the trees. I was heading back to my cruiser to radio in the abandoned vehicle when I heard something that made my blood run cold, branches snapping, and what sounded like whimpering coming from the dense forest. I followed the sounds, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I pushed through the snow-laden branches. The cold was so intense it felt like needles piercing my skin, and I couldn't understand why anyone would venture into these woods in such conditions. Every instinct told me something was terribly wrong. The sounds grew louder as I went deeper into the forest, and then I saw something that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. About 30 feet ahead of me, a young man was kneeling in the snow wearing nothing but shorts and a tank top, no shoes, no coat. His body was convulsing violently, like he was having some kind of seizure, but he remained upright on his knees the entire time. But that wasn't what terrified me. Standing over him was a creature that defied every law of nature I knew. It looked like a massive goat, but it was easily 7 feet tall, standing upright on its hind legs. Its fur was pitch black, and its eyes glowed red in the beam of my flashlight. One of its cloven hooves was pressed against the young man's head, and I could hear a low, rumbling sound coming from its throat. I stood frozen, my 20 years of police training completely useless in the face of this nightmare. The creature must have sensed my presence, because it suddenly turned its head toward me, those burning red eyes boring into mine. Then it released the young man and bounded away on its hind legs, crashing through the underbrush until it disappeared into the darkness. The moment the creature let go, the young man collapsed into the snow, sobbing and screaming hysterically. I rushed to him, wrapping him in my jacket and helping him to his feet. He was in complete shock, shaking uncontrollably from both the cold and whatever had just happened to him. I got him into my heated cruiser and called for an ambulance, but given our remote location, it took nearly an hour and a half for the paramedics to reach us. During that time, the young man, I learned his name was Marcus, could barely speak through his tears and chattering teeth. When we finally got him to the hospital in Denver, it took several more hours before he was calm enough to give a statement. What he told me made my skin crawl. Marcus lived alone with his terminally ill mother in a small town about 50 miles from where I found him. Desperate to save her life, he had attempted to make some kind of deal with dark forces he didn't understand. He'd been using old books he'd found online, performing rituals in his basement, trying to contact something that could heal his mother. For weeks after his first attempt, he said he'd been experiencing terrifying visions and hearing voices. Objects in his house would move on their own, shadows would take strange shapes, and he'd wake up with scratches and bruises he couldn't explain. On the night I found him, he claimed something had taken control of his body while he was sleeping. He found himself getting dressed and walking out to his car, but he couldn't control his actions. He drove for hours through the storm, following roads he'd never been on before, until he reached that exact spot in the forest. "I couldn't stop myself," he whispered, his voice barely audible. It was like being trapped inside my own body, watching someone else control everything. That thing in the woods, it's been hunting me ever since I made that deal. I saw it in my dreams, and now it found me. I had him tested for drugs, alcohol, any kind of substance that might explain his condition, but he came back completely clean. We verified his mother's illness. She was indeed dying of cancer and had been bedridden for months. Psychiatric evaluation showed no signs of mental illness or delusion. Despite having no legal grounds to hold him, I was terrified to let him go. But after 72 hours, we had no choice but to release him. The only thing we could do was confiscate his driver's license. I never found out what happened to Marcus after that. Sometimes I wonder if he's still alive, or if that creature eventually claimed what it came for. What I do know is that I'll never forget the sight of that thing in the forest, or the feeling of pure evil that radiated from it. In all my years of law enforcement, I've seen plenty of things that couldn't be easily explained. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that night on the Devil's Highway. There are forces in this world that we don't understand, and sometimes, when people go looking for them, those forces come looking back. I've been a police officer in Detroit for over 15 years now, working my way up from patrol to detective. But what I'm about to tell you happened during my rookie year, and it's something that still gives me chills. This was back in 2008, during the height of the gang violence in the city. I was working the midnight shift in one of the rougher neighborhoods, where drive-by shootings and drug deals were as common as corner stores. We had multiple units patrolling different sectors, trying to keep some semblance of order in an area that felt like it was falling apart. I was stopped at a red light around 2 a.m, my patrol car idling behind an old, beat-up Buick that looked like it had seen better days 20 years ago. The paint was faded, the bumper was hanging off, and there were so many dents I couldn't tell what color it was supposed to be. That's when I saw him, a small child's face pressed against the rear window. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, and he was frantically banging his little fists against the glass, his mouth open in what looked like a silent scream for help. My heart started racing. In that neighborhood, seeing a child in distress at that hour usually meant one thing: something very bad was happening. The light turned green and the Buick started moving. I hit my lights and sirens, expecting the driver to pull over immediately, but instead, the car suddenly accelerated. For such a piece of junk, that car moved like it had a rocket engine under the hood. I radioed for backup and gave pursuit, following the Buick as it weaved through residential streets, running stop signs and red lights. The driver was heading toward the freeway, and I knew if he got there, things would get much more dangerous for everyone involved. My backup unit, Officer Martinez, managed to get ahead of us and position himself at the on-ramp. When the Buick tried to merge onto I-75, Martinez blocked his path, forcing him to veer onto the shoulder. The driver, a scraggly man in his 40s with wild eyes and dirty clothes, jumped out and tried to run, but Martinez tackled him before he could get 10 feet. While Martinez was cuffing the suspect, I ran straight to the car, expecting to find that terrified little boy. The car was empty. I checked the front seats, the back seats, even under the seats. Nothing. No sign that a child had ever been in that vehicle. I marched over to where Martinez had the suspect on the ground and demanded to know where the child was. The man looked at me like I was insane. "What kid?" he kept saying. "I don't know what you're talking about, officer. I was driving alone." I was getting frustrated, convinced he was lying. I'd seen that boy clear as day, banging on the window, pleading for help. I grabbed the keys from the suspect and popped the trunk. That's where I found her, a little girl, maybe 3 years old, unconscious and barely breathing. She was so small, so still, that for a horrible moment I thought we were too late. But when I picked her up, I could feel her chest rising and falling, weak but steady. We called an ambulance immediately, and thank God, the paramedics were able to revive her. She'd been deprived of oxygen, but was going to be okay. After hours of interrogation, the suspect finally broke down and confessed everything. He'd abducted both children from a playground earlier that evening, the little girl and her older brother. The boy had tried to escape while the man was loading the girl into the trunk, so the suspect had. He'd killed the boy and buried him in his backyard. The monster was sentenced to life in prison, and we were able to save the little girl, but we were too late for her brother. When I saw his picture during the trial, I knew immediately that he was the child I'd seen in the back window of that car. Same dark hair, same frightened eyes, same desperate expression. The thing is, according to the coroner's report, that little boy had been dead for at least 6 hours before I ever saw him in that car. There was no way he could have been there, banging on that window, trying to get my attention. But he was there. I saw him as clearly as I'm seeing you right now. And I believe with every fiber of my being that he saved his sister's life. Even in death, he was still trying to protect her, still fighting to get someone's attention so we could find her before it was too late. This case changed me. It made me realize that love, especially the love between siblings, doesn't end with death. That little boy couldn't rest until he knew his sister was safe, and somehow, someway, he found a way to lead us to her. I've worked hundreds of cases since then, but I'll never forget the image of that child's face in the window, or the knowledge that sometimes the dead don't stay gone when the people they love are still in danger. It's a reminder that there are forces in this world we don't understand, and sometimes, just sometimes, those forces are on our side. I've been a police officer in Tucson, Arizona for 9 years now, working my way up from patrol to detective work. During that time, I've seen my share of disturbing crime scenes, but there's one case that stands out not just for its brutality, but for something unexplainable that happened during our investigation. My name is Officer Hernandez, and I'm of Mexican descent, though I was born and raised here in the States. This particular incident occurred in the Desert Winds Mobile Home Park, a community on the outskirts of town, where many working-class families and retirees live in aging trailers and manufactured homes. My partner, Detective Morrison, and I were called to the scene around 11:30 on a Thursday night. The dispatch came in as a welfare check. Residents had been complaining about a terrible smell coming from one of the mobile homes, and it had been getting progressively worse over the past 2 days. When we arrived, there were about a dozen neighbors standing around outside the mobile home in question, most of them covering their noses with shirts or handkerchiefs. The smell hit us the moment we stepped out of our patrol car. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, a sickly sweet, putrid odor that seemed to cling to your clothes and hair. Morrison, who had 15 years of experience and had worked homicide before transferring to our unit, immediately recognized what we were dealing with. "That's a decomposing body," he said grimly, "and it's been there for a while." We spoke with the woman who had called it in, a middle-aged retiree named Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 trailers down. She explained that the smell had started that morning, but had become unbearable by evening. She'd tried knocking on the door several times, but no one answered. According to the neighbors, the trailer was home to a man named Robert Kellerman, probably in his early 40s. He'd moved into the community about 6 months earlier, but had kept to himself. Even in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, nobody really knew anything about him. He rarely came outside, didn't socialize, and seemed to go out of his way to avoid contact with his neighbors. After trying unsuccessfully to get a response from inside the trailer, Morrison and I decided we had probable cause to make entry. The door was unlocked, which should have been our first red flag. The smell inside was overwhelming, so strong that we both had to step back outside to catch our breath. When we finally managed to get inside with our flashlights, we found clear signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned, dishes were smashed on the floor, and there were what looked like bullet holes in the far wall. The trailer had a simple layout: a living area, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with an attached bathroom. In the bedroom, we found a large, dark stain on the beige carpet that had clearly been there for several days. The stain was roughly human-shaped, as if someone had been lying there for an extended period after death. But there was no body. We searched every inch of that trailer, under the bed, in the closets, even in the small storage areas. Nothing. Just that stain on the carpet and the unmistakable smell of death. Morrison called for backup and a crime scene unit, and we cordoned off the area. While we waited for the additional units to arrive, we continued our search of the premises. I was in the bedroom, taking photographs of the stain, when Morrison joined me. We were both focused on examining the evidence when we heard something that made us both freeze. A whisper, clear as day, coming from somewhere inside the room. "Look down." Morrison and I locked eyes, both of us having heard the exact same thing. Our body cameras were rolling, so I know it wasn't our imagination. The voice was male, soft but urgent, and it seemed to come from directly below us. We immediately began searching the room again, looking for any signs of a hidden compartment or basement access. The trailer was old, built in the 1980s, and set up on concrete blocks rather than a permanent foundation. When the canine unit arrived 20 minutes later, the dogs immediately started showing interest in the area directly under the bedroom. That's when we realized we needed to search beneath the mobile home itself. What we found under there was one of the most disturbing crime scenes I've ever worked. Robert Kellerman's body was wedged into the cramped space between the floor joists, wrapped in plastic sheeting. He'd been shot twice in the chest at close range, probably with a small caliber pistol equipped with a suppressor, which explained why none of the neighbors had heard gunshots. The killer had initially left the body in the bedroom, but had apparently returned later to move it to a location where it would be harder to find. The problem was, decomposition doesn't stop just because you move a body, and the smell had eventually given away the location. Through security camera footage from a nearby convenience store and cell phone records, we were able to identify two suspects, a pair of drug dealers who had apparently been involved in some kind of business dispute with Kellerman. The case is still ongoing, as we haven't been able to locate the murder weapon, but we have enough evidence to proceed with prosecution. The thing that still bothers me, though, is that whisper. We've played back the audio from our body cameras dozens of times, and it's definitely there, a clear, unmistakable voice telling us to look down. But there was no one else in that trailer with us. Morrison and I have talked about it extensively, and we both believe it was Kellerman himself, somehow managing to communicate with us from beyond death. Maybe he was frustrated that his body had been hidden, that his killer thought they could just make him disappear. Maybe he wanted to make sure justice was served. I've heard of electronic voice phenomena before, unexplained voices that show up on recordings in places where people have died. But this was different. This was a direct communication, a specific instruction that led us to crucial evidence. In all my years of police work, I've learned to trust my instincts and to keep an open mind about things that don't have easy explanations. Sometimes the dead have something to say, and if you're willing to listen, they might just help you solve their own murder. The case is still active, so I can't release the audio recording, but I can tell you that it's something I'll never forget. Robert Kellerman may be gone, but his voice led us to the truth, and sometimes that's all a victim can ask for. I'm a police officer in rural Montana, working in a small county where everyone knows everyone else's business. Or at least, that's what we thought until this happened. I've been on the force for 8 years now, mostly doing patrol work, driving the back roads, and keeping an eye on things during both day and night shifts. This particular week had been brutal. We were short-staffed because 2 officers were out with the flu, so I'd been pulling double duty, working 5 consecutive night shifts. By that 5th night, I was running on fumes and way too much coffee. My partner Jake wasn't doing much better. Our job description is pretty straightforward: prevent crime through visible patrol presence. That means when we're not responding to actual calls, we're supposed to be out there driving around, making our presence known. Sleeping on duty is considered abandonment of post and can get you fired faster than you can say, union rep. But that night, around 3 in the morning, Jake and I were both dead on our feet. We'd been driving for hours without a single call, just endless loops through empty farmland and sleeping subdivisions. Finally, Jake suggested we pull over for just a few minutes to rest our eyes. "Just 10 minutes," he said. "We'll keep the radio on." We found a spot on a dirt road about 2 miles outside town, parked behind a line of cottonwood trees where our patrol car wouldn't be visible from the main highway. The October air was crisp and cold, typical for Montana at that time of year, and within minutes, we were both dozing in our seats. I wasn't fully asleep, more like that twilight state where you're aware of your surroundings, but your body is finally getting some rest. The radio was crackling softly with occasional check-ins from dispatch, and Jake was snoring lightly in the passenger seat. Then I heard it, a soft tapping on my window. My eyes snapped open, and my heart immediately started racing. My first thought was that a supervisor had caught us sleeping, and we were about to get written up. But when I looked to my left, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Standing next to my patrol car was a little girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old. She had long, dark hair and was wearing a simple white nightgown that came down to her knees. What struck me as odd wasn't just her presence. It was the fact that she was dressed so lightly when the temperature had to be in the 30s. I shook Jake awake and quickly rolled down my window. The little girl looked up at me with the most serious expression I've ever seen on a child's face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and her eyes seemed much older than her years. "What are you doing out here, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice gentle and calm. "Where are your parents?" She didn't answer my questions. Instead, she raised her small hand and pointed toward a cluster of trees about 50 yards away. "I'm buried over there," she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "under the old Miller house." I followed her gaze and squinted into the darkness. Through the bare branches of the cottonwoods, I could just make out the silhouette of what looked like the remains of an old farmhouse, broken roof timbers, a crumbling chimney, walls that had partially collapsed. The strange thing was, I'd patrolled this area hundreds of times over the years, and I could have sworn there was nothing but empty field in that direction. How had I never noticed those ruins before? "Buried," I repeated, trying to process what she just said. "Honey, what do you mean? Are you hurt? Do you need help?" But when I looked back down, she was gone. Not walking away, not running, just gone. Vanished. Like she'd never been there at all. Jake, I shook my partner harder. Jake, did you see that little girl? He sat up, rubbing his eyes and looking around confused. What girl? What are you talking about? I explained what had just happened, pointing toward where the child had been standing, and then toward the ruins she'd indicated. Jake listened with growing skepticism written all over his face. Dude, you were dreaming, he said. We both dozed off for a few minutes. You had a nightmare, that's all. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew what I'd heard. The girl's voice had been crystal clear, and her words kept echoing in my head. I'm buried over there. We drove closer to investigate, our headlights sweeping across the field. Sure enough, there were the remnants of an old structure, a foundation made of field stone, scattered lumber that had once been walls, and debris that suggested the place had been abandoned for decades. Jake remained unconvinced. It's just an old homestead, he said. This whole area used to be farmland back in the 1920s and 30s. Lots of families lost their land during the Depression and just walked away from their houses. He was probably right about the history, but that didn't explain the little girl or her specific words about being buried there. The rest of our shift passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the image of that pale child in her white nightgown, or the way she'd pointed so deliberately toward those ruins. 3 days later, on my day off, I drove back to the location. This time I brought a shovel and my metal detector equipment I sometimes used for a hobby of searching old homesteads for historical artifacts. I spent about an hour examining the ruins more carefully. The foundation was definitely old, probably from the 1920s based on the construction style. There were rusted pieces of farm equipment scattered around, broken dishes, even an old cast-iron stove that had somehow survived the elements. But it was while I was scanning the area with my metal detector that I found something that made my stomach drop. About 20 feet from what had once been the back porch, the detector started going crazy. I dug down about 18 inches and hit something solid. It was a small metal box, badly corroded but still intact. Inside were some old photographs, a child's bracelet, and a folded piece of paper that had somehow remained readable despite the moisture and age. The paper was a handwritten note dated 1932. It was brief, written in a shaky hand. Sarah Miller, age 10, beloved daughter, taken by the fever, could not afford proper burial. God forgive us. My hands were shaking as I read those words. Sarah Miller, the ruins of the Miller house, a 10-year-old girl. I called the county coroner's office the next day and reported what I'd found. They sent out a team with ground-penetrating radar, and within hours, they'd located what appeared to be human remains in a shallow grave near where I'd found the metal box. The excavation took 2 days. They found the complete skeleton of a child, along with fragments of cloth that might have once been a white dress or nightgown. The county medical examiner estimated the remains had been there for nearly 90 years. Further research into county records revealed that the Miller family had indeed lived on that property during the Great Depression. They'd lost their farm to the bank in 1932, the same year their daughter Sarah had died of influenza. With no money for a proper funeral and burial, they'd apparently laid her to rest on their own land before abandoning the property. Sarah Miller was finally given a proper burial in the town cemetery, with a headstone paid for by donations from the community. I attended the service, along with about 50 other people who'd heard the story. I never told anyone about seeing the little girl that night, not even Jake, who still thinks I dreamed the whole thing. But I know what I experienced. I believe Sarah Miller's spirit had been waiting all those years for someone to find her, to give her the dignity in death that her family couldn't afford to provide in life. Sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling those same back roads, I find myself looking for her again. Part of me hopes I'll see her one more time, just to know she's finally at peace. But the field where the Miller house once stood is empty now, and I think that's exactly how it should be. I was a Detroit police officer for 15 years before a back injury forced me into early retirement. During that time, I saw just about everything you can imagine: robberies, domestic violence, drug deals gone wrong, gang shootings. You name it, I probably responded to it at least once. But there's one case that still keeps me awake at night, even though it happened 7 years ago. It was a Tuesday evening in late September. I remember because the Tigers were in the playoffs that year, and most of the city was glued to their televisions watching the game. My partner Rodriguez and I were working the evening shift in the Corktown district, one of the older neighborhoods near downtown. The area we were patrolling was mostly residential rows of small houses built back in the 1940s for auto workers and their families. It was a working-class neighborhood that had seen better days, but it wasn't the worst part of our beat. Most of the residents were decent people, just trying to get by. Around 9:30, we were driving slowly down Leverett Street when Rodriguez nudged me and pointed ahead. "Look, somebody's trying to flag us down." About half a block ahead, I could see 2 figures standing under a streetlight, waving their arms to get our attention. As we got closer, I could see it was a young couple, maybe in their early 20s, with a medium-sized dog on a leash. The dog was a mixed breed, looked like maybe part German Shepherd, and he was acting extremely agitated. We pulled over and both got out to see what was going on. The couple seemed nervous, but not panicked, more like they weren't sure if what they'd experienced was worth calling the police over. "Officers, I'm sorry to bother you," the young man said, "but we were walking Oscar here." He gestured to the dog, and something really weird happened. His girlfriend stepped forward. "We were just walking past that car there," she said, pointing to a dark blue sedan parked about 20 feet away, and Oscar started going crazy. He wouldn't stop barking and pulling toward it. "That's when we heard it," the boyfriend continued. "There were sounds coming from the trunk, like someone knocking, and we thought we heard a woman's voice calling for help." Rodriguez and I exchanged glances. This could be anything from a prank to a kidnapping situation. We had to take it seriously. "How long ago was this?" I asked. "Just a few minutes," the girlfriend said. "We stood here listening for maybe 5 minutes, and the sounds kept coming. Knocking, and what sounded like muffled screaming. That's when we decided to flag you down." I walked over to the car while Rodriguez continued questioning the couple. It was an older model Buick, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with Michigan plates. I put my ear close to the trunk and listened carefully. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then, just as I was about to step away, there was a definite thudding sound from inside, followed by what might have been a weak voice calling out. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Rodriguez," I called out, "get over here." He jogged over, and I had him listen as well. We both heard it rhythmic knocking, like someone tapping with their fist or palm, and what sounded like a woman's voice, though the words were muffled and unclear. "We need to find the owner of this car," Rodriguez said, looking around. "Right now." The car was parked in front of a 4-story apartment building with about 20 units. We told the young couple to stay back with their dog, then headed into the building to start knocking on doors. Most residents answered quickly. It was prime-time television hours, so people were home and awake. We showed our badges and asked about the blue Buick parked outside. Several people recognized it as belonging to a man named Dennis Kowalski, who lived in apartment 4B on the top floor. We climbed the stairs 2 at a time and pounded on Kowalski's door. No answer. We tried again, calling out that we were police officers and needed to speak with him immediately. Still nothing. The hallway was silent, and we could see that no light was coming from under his door. It looked like nobody was home. "We can't wait," I told Rodriguez. "If someone's trapped in that trunk, they could be running out of air." We headed back downstairs and outside to the car. The young couple was still waiting, and their dog was still agitated, whining and pulling toward the vehicle. "Did you hear anything else?" Rodriguez asked them. "Yes," the girlfriend said. "Just a minute ago, there were 3 or 4 loud bangs, like someone hitting the inside of the trunk with both fists. That settled it for me." We radioed for backup and a supervisor, then Rodriguez got our crowbar from the patrol car. Department policy required us to have probable cause before breaking into someone's vehicle. But the sounds we were hearing and the couple's testimony gave us more than enough justification. Rodriguez jimmied the driver's side window while I kept watch. It took him about 30 seconds to get the door open and pop the trunk release. I'll never forget what I saw when that trunk lid opened. There was a large black garbage bag inside, but no person. My heart sank because I knew immediately what we were probably looking at. In my years on the force, I'd seen enough crime scenes to recognize the signs. "Folks, I need you to take your dog and go home now," I called out to the couple. "Thank you for reporting this, but we need you to leave the scene." They didn't argue. They could probably tell from our expressions that this wasn't going to be good. Rodriguez and I carefully lifted the garbage bag out of the trunk and set it on the ground behind the car. It was heavy, probably 60 or 70 pounds, and had been tied shut with rope. When we opened it, the first things I saw were long strands of brown hair and a woman's hand. I won't go into more detail out of respect for the victim, but it was clear that this was a recent crime. The body had been dismembered, and based on the condition, it had probably happened within the last day or 2. We immediately called for homicide detectives and the crime scene unit. While we waited for them to arrive, Rodriguez and I secured the area and started canvassing the other apartments to see if anyone had seen Dennis Kowalski recently. When the detectives arrived, they coordinated with building management to get into Kowalski's apartment. What they found was a scene of extreme violence, blood spatter on the walls, obvious signs of a struggle, and various tools that had apparently been used to dismember the victim. Kowalski himself was nowhere to be found, but they put out a BOLO alert, and he was arrested 2 days later trying to cross into Canada at the Ambassador Bridge. During questioning, he confessed to killing his girlfriend during an argument and then panicking about how to dispose of her body. The case went to trial 8 months later, and Kowalski was convicted of first-degree murder. He's serving life without parole at the state prison in Jackson. But here's the thing that still haunts me about that night. According to the medical examiner's report, the victim had been dead for at least 18 to 20 hours before we found her body. There's no way she could have been knocking on the inside of that trunk or calling for help. Yet Rodriguez and I both heard those sounds, and so did the young couple with their dog. We all heard the same thing, rhythmic knocking, and what sounded like a woman's voice calling out. I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I've come to believe that sometimes, when someone dies in a particularly violent or unjust way, some part of them refuses to let go. Maybe it was her spirit that led that couple and their dog to that exact spot at that exact time. Maybe she was still fighting, even after death, to make sure her killer didn't get away with it. I never shared these thoughts with Rodriguez or anyone else on the force. In police work, you learn to stick to the facts and keep your personal theories to yourself. But I know what I heard that night, and I believe that young woman's spirit was calling out for justice. And in the end, that's exactly what she got. I've been working as a police officer in suburban Phoenix for 12 years now, and I've responded to just about every type of domestic call you can imagine. Break-ins, domestic disputes, suspicious persons. It all comes with the territory. But there's one call from about 4 years ago that I still can't fully explain, no matter how many times I've gone over it in my head. It was a Thursday night in November, around 11:30. I was working solo that evening because my usual partner had called in sick with food poisoning. The dispatcher sent me to a residential address in one of the newer subdivisions on the north side of town. A woman calling about an intruder in her house. The information I received was pretty basic. Single mother with 2 small children, reporting that someone had broken into her home and was hiding somewhere inside. She was outside with her kids, waiting for police to arrive. I pulled up to a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood where most of the other homes were already dark for the night. The woman was standing on her front lawn holding a baby, maybe 8 months old, with a little boy who looked about 4 years old clinging to her leg. I introduced myself and asked her to walk me through exactly what had happened. She seemed remarkably calm considering the circumstances, which I thought was unusual. Most people who think there's an intruder in their house are pretty shaken up. "Officer, I know this is going to sound strange," she began, "but I think someone was in my son's bedroom talking to him." She explained that she'd been sleeping in her own room with the baby when she was woken up by the sound of voices coming from her older son's room next door. At first, she thought maybe he was talking in his sleep or playing with one of his toys. But as she listened more carefully, she realized there were 2 distinct voices, her son's and what sounded like an adult woman. "I got up to check on him," she continued, "but when I tried to turn the doorknob, the door was locked from the inside. That's when I knew something was really wrong, because Tyler doesn't know how to lock his bedroom door. He's only 4. She said she could hear her son crying and what sounded like the woman's voice trying to calm him down, but she couldn't make out the specific words. When she knocked on the door and called out to Tyler, he started screaming for help, That's when I ran to the kitchen and got a hammer, she said. I broke the lock and got the door open, and Tyler ran straight to me. He was terrified, but he couldn't tell me who had been in his room. When I searched the room, there was nobody there. I asked her about possible ways someone could have escaped from the room. She said there was only one window, and it had security bars on it, so nobody could have gotten out that way. Plus, she would have heard if someone had broken the glass trying to climb out. I looked everywhere in that room, she insisted. Under the bed, in the closet, behind the dresser. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. I told her to wait outside with her children while I went in to search the house thoroughly. I started with the first floor, checking every room, every closet, behind every piece of furniture large enough to conceal a person. The back door was locked from the inside, and all the windows were secure. No signs of forced entry anywhere. I went upstairs and continued my search. The master bedroom was clear, as was the bathroom and a small office that the woman apparently used as a workspace. That left the little boy's room. It was a typical 4-year-old's bedroom, twin bed with cartoon sheets, toy chest, small dresser, and stuffed animals scattered around. There was indeed only one window, and it had iron security bars just as the mother had described. Nobody could have gotten in or out through that window. The door showed obvious damage where she'd broken the lock with the hammer. I examined it carefully and confirmed that it had definitely been locked from the inside. There were fresh wood chips and metal fragments on the floor where the lock mechanism had been forced. I was getting ready to go back downstairs and tell the woman that I hadn't found any evidence of an intruder when something caught my eye. There was a large mirror mounted on the wall at the top of the staircase, positioned so that someone coming up or going down the stairs could see around the corner. As I started down the stairs, I glanced into that mirror and froze. For just a split second, I saw the reflection of a woman standing at the top of the staircase behind me. She appeared to be middle-aged, with dark hair pulled back, wearing what looked like a white or light-colored dress. But what stopped me cold was the expression on her face. She looked absolutely terrified. I spun around immediately, but there was nobody there. I looked back at the mirror, and the reflection was gone too. For a moment, I wondered if I was seeing things. I'd been working a lot of overtime lately, and I was tired. But I was sure of what I'd seen, even if it had only lasted a second or two. I finished searching the upstairs area, including looking behind the mirror to see if there was some kind of hidden space or optical illusion that could explain what I'd witnessed. There wasn't. When I went back outside, I told the woman that I hadn't found any evidence of an intruder and that the house appeared to be secure. She seemed relieved, but still worried. "Officer, can I tell you something else?" she asked. "This isn't the first time Tyler has mentioned seeing a woman in his room. For the past few weeks, he's been telling me that a lady comes and stands next to his bed at night. I thought he was just having bad dreams, but after tonight." She trailed off, looking uncertain about whether to continue. "What else?" I prompted. "He says the lady looks sad, and she can't move her arms or legs. He says she just stands there looking at him, and it scares him so much that he can't move or call out. That's why I thought it was just nightmares." A chill ran down my spine as she described this. The woman I'd seen in the mirror had appeared to be in some kind of distress, and there had been something unnatural about the way she was standing. I asked the mother how long they'd been living in the house. She said they'd moved in about 3 months earlier and were renting from the previous owner, who had moved to Florida after his wife died. Did the landlord tell you anything about his wife? I asked. How she died, I mean. The woman shook her head. He just said she'd been sick for a while. Why do you ask? I didn't want to frighten her any more than she already was, so I just suggested that she might want to have her son sleep in her room for a few nights until he felt more comfortable. I also gave her my card and told her not to hesitate to call if anything else unusual happened. Before I left, though, I couldn't help asking one more question. Did your landlord's wife have dark hair, maybe shoulder length, pulled back? The woman looked surprised. Actually, yes. He showed me a photo of her once when he was telling me about the flower garden she'd planted in the backyard. She had dark hair in a ponytail, and she was wearing a white sundress in the picture. How did you know that? I told her I was just curious and left it at that. But as I drove away from the house that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in that mirror. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but I also trust my own eyes and instincts. Over the next few weeks, I found myself driving past that house during my patrols, just to check on things. I never saw any more patrol cars there or received any additional calls from that address, so I assumed everything had returned to normal. About 2 months later, I ran into the woman at a grocery store. She recognized me and came over to say hello. How's your son doing? I asked. Any more problems with nighttime visitors? She smiled and shook her head. Actually, no. The strangest thing happened about a week after you came to the house. Tyler woke me up one morning and said the sad lady had come to say goodbye. He said she wasn't sad anymore and that she was going to go find her husband. And that was it. That was it. He hasn't mentioned seeing her since then, and he's been sleeping fine in his own room. I never told her what I'd seen in the mirror that night, and I probably never will. But I have my own theory about what happened in that house. I think the previous owner's wife had died there, possibly in that upstairs hallway, and for some reason her spirit had remained behind. Maybe she was confused or lost, or maybe she was trying to protect the house she'd loved. I believe she was drawn to the little boy because children are more open to seeing things that adults have learned to dismiss or ignore. And I think that once she realized she was frightening him, she found a way to move on to wherever she was supposed to go. I know how that sounds coming from a police officer. We're trained to deal in facts and evidence, not ghost stories. But sometimes you encounter things that can't be explained by conventional logic, and you have to trust your instincts about what really happened. I hope that woman, whatever her name, was found peace and was reunited with her husband. And I hope that little boy grows up without any memory of those frightening nights when she visited his room. I retired from the police force 3 years ago after 26 years of service. But there's one incident from back in 2009 that I've never been able to forget. It was something so far outside the realm of normal police work that I've never told the complete story to anyone. Not my wife, not my former colleagues, not even my therapist when I was dealing with PTSD from some of the other cases I'd worked. I was stationed in a mid-sized city in upstate New York, working the midnight shift with my partner Mike Hendricks. Contrary to what most people think, the night shift was actually the quietest time to be on patrol. all the domestic disturbances, traffic accidents, and bar fights happened during the day and evening hours. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., it was mostly just routine patrols and the occasional drunk driver. This particular night in late October, Mike and I exchanged glances. We had to report this incident to our supervisor, but we both knew how it was going to sound. Two veteran police officers claiming they'd seen a woman transform into a giant bird after cannibalizing a corpse. It was the kind of story that gets you referred for psychological evaluation. "Frank," I said, "have you ever seen them during the day, or figured out where they come from?" He shook his head. "Only at night, and only when the moon is dark or nearly dark. They seem to appear out of nowhere and disappear the same way. But I can tell you this, they're not human. Not anymore, anyway." We spent the rest of our shift filling out incident reports and trying to figure out how to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. In the end, we stuck to the basic facts. Vandalism at the cemetery, evidence of grave desecration. Suspects fled the scene before they could be apprehended. Our supervisor wasn't happy that we'd failed to catch whoever was responsible, but he didn't question our account of events. At least, not the sanitized version we gave him. The coroner's office came out the next day to examine Michael Patterson's remains and reinter them properly. The medical examiner confirmed that the limbs had been torn away rather than cut, but attributed it to vandals using some kind of heavy machinery. Frank called us back to the cemetery 3 more times over the next 6 months, always with similar reports. But by the time we arrived, there was never any evidence of disturbance. It was like the creatures, whatever they were, had learned to be more careful about covering their tracks. Then the calls stopped altogether. Frank told us later that he'd stopped seeing the women entirely after that first encounter. He thought maybe they'd moved on to a different hunting ground, or maybe they'd been scared off by the increased police attention. Mike retired 2 years later and moved to Florida. We stayed in touch for a while, but we never talked about what happened that night at Greenwood Cemetery. Some experiences are too far outside normal reality to discuss, even with someone who shared them with you. Frank Morrison worked at the cemetery for 3 more years before retiring. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd started having health problems, insomnia, anxiety attacks, chronic nightmares. He never said it was connected to his job, but I had my suspicions. I've done some research over the years, trying to find explanations for what we encountered that night. There are legends in various cultures about creatures that feed on the dead ghouls, revenants, shapeshifters that can take the form of birds. Some Native American tribes in this region have stories about wendigos and other cannibalistic entities. But research can only take you so far when you're dealing with something that shouldn't exist according to everything we understand about the natural world. I think about those creatures sometimes, especially late at night when I'm lying awake wondering if they're still out there somewhere. I wonder if they were once human beings who became something else through some terrible transformation, or if they were always something other than human, just wearing human shapes when it suited their purposes. What haunts me most is the possibility that there are more of them out there, in other cities, other cemeteries. And that somewhere, another night security guard is seeing impossible things and wondering if he's losing his mind. I hope Frank Morrison found peace in his retirement. And I hope Mike is enjoying his golden years in Florida, without any memories of that October night, when we learned that the world contains horrors beyond anything they prepare you for in police academy. As for me, I drive past Greenwood Cemetery sometimes when I'm in that part of town. It looks peaceful enough during the day, with its rolling green hills and old shade trees. But I never go there after dark, and I never will. Some secrets are better left buried. I were doing our usual rounds through the downtown area when we got a call from dispatch around 2:30 in the morning. We were needed at Greenwood Cemetery, the old municipal cemetery on the east side of town. The night watchman had called in requesting immediate police assistance, reporting vandalism and possible grave desecration. Greenwood Cemetery was established back in 1872 and covered about 40 acres of rolling hills dotted with old oak and maple trees. It wasn't the kind of place that typically saw much trouble, aside from the occasional teenager spray painting graffiti on headstones or drinking beer among the monuments. When we arrived, the security guard was waiting for us at the main gate. His name was Frank Morrison, a guy in his early 60s who'd been working cemetery security for about 8 years. Frank was usually pretty calm and collected, but that night he was visibly shaken. "Officers, thank God you're here," he said as we pulled up. "Something terrible has happened back in section. See, someone's dug up one of the graves." Mike and I got out of the patrol car and followed Frank through the winding cemetery roads toward the older section, where most of the burials from the early 1900s were located. Our flashlights cut through the darkness as Frank explained what he'd witnessed. "I was doing my regular rounds around 2 a.m. when I heard sounds coming from this direction," he said. "Loud scraping noises, like someone digging, and what sounded like voices, maybe 2 people talking in low voices." He led us to a gravesite where it was immediately obvious that someone had been busy. The headstone read, "Michael Patterson, 1884 to 1910, beloved son and father." The grave had been completely excavated, not just surface vandalism, but someone had actually dug down to the coffin level. "When I got here," Frank continued, "I saw 2 figures running away toward the older section with the mausoleums. They were moving incredibly fast, faster than anyone should be able to run, especially across uneven ground in the dark. What was most disturbing was the condition of the remains. The coffin had been partially opened, and Michael Patterson's body was lying half in and half out of the casket. But it wasn't just disturbed, it had been mutilated. The arms and legs had been removed, and from the looks of the torn flesh and splintered bones, they hadn't been cut off with tools. They'd been ripped away with tremendous force. Mike and I immediately began searching the cemetery for whoever was responsible. Greenwood was a large area with hundreds of old trees, crumbling mausoleums, and overgrown sections where the groundskeeping had been neglected over the years. There were plenty of places for someone to hide. We split up to cover more ground, staying in radio contact as we worked our way through different sections of the cemetery. The whole place had an eerie atmosphere that night fog was rolling in from the river, and our flashlight beams created strange shadows among the headstones and monuments. After about 20 minutes of searching, Mike radioed that he'd found something near the section where Frank had seen the figures running. I made my way over to where he was standing beneath a massive old elm tree that had to be at least 100 years old. "Listen," he whispered, motioning for me to be quiet. I stood perfectly still and strained to hear whatever he detected. At first, there was nothing but the normal sounds of night wind rustling through leaves, the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Then I heard it too. Someone was laughing. It was a woman's voice, but there was something wrong with it. The laughter was too loud, too harsh, and it had a manic quality that made my skin crawl. Mike pointed his flashlight up into the branches of the elm tree. And what we saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. About 20 feet up, sitting on one of the larger branches, was a woman. She appeared to be middle-aged, maybe in her 50s, with wild gray hair that hung down around her shoulders. Her clothes were tattered and filthy, like she'd been living rough for months. But it was what she was doing that made both Mike and me freeze, in absolute horror. She was gnawing on a human arm, Michael Patterson's arm, torn from his corpse. Blood was running down her chin and neck, and she was making disgusting smacking and slurping sounds as she fed. When our flashlight beam hit her, she looked down at us with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. She let out another one of those horrible laughs, then scrambled higher up into the tree with a speed and agility that no human being should possess. Mike was so shocked he couldn't move or speak. I tried to yell for her to come down, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. We watched in stunned silence as she reached the very top of the tree, clutching what remained of the severed arm. Then something happened that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The woman leaped from the top of the elm tree, a fall that should have killed her instantly. But instead of plummeting to the ground, she transformed. Her body seemed to dissolve and reshape itself, and a massive black bird took flight from where she had been. It was larger than any crow or raven I'd ever seen, with a wingspan that had to be at least 6 feet. The creature circled overhead once, letting out a harsh cry that sounded almost like mocking laughter, then disappeared into the fog and darkness. Mike and I stood there for several minutes, neither of us able to process what we'd just witnessed. Finally, Mike found his voice. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. We made our way back to where Frank was waiting and told him what we'd seen. I expected him to think we'd lost our minds, but his reaction surprised me. "That's the second woman," he said matter-of-factly. "I've seen them both before, though never this close." "What do you mean, the second woman?" I asked. Frank looked uncomfortable, like he was debating whether to tell us something he'd been keeping to himself. Finally, he sighed and continued. "I've been working here for 8 years, and for the past 2 years, I've been seeing strange things. 2 women who come here in the middle of the night, usually around 2 or 3 a.m. They dig up recent graves, always people who have been buried within the last month or 2. He explained that he'd reported the incidents to his supervisor and to the police, but nobody had ever found any evidence. The graves were always restored by morning, with no sign that they'd been disturbed. I started thinking I was going crazy," Frank admitted. "But tonight was different. Tonight they left evidence behind, and now you've seen them too." Mike and I spent 23 years as a police officer in Detroit, and I've seen things that would make most people lose sleep for weeks. But there's one case from November of 2000, and one that still haunts me to this day. Even now, more than 2 decades later, I can barely talk about it without feeling that familiar chill run down my spine. I was working the night shift with my partner, Sarah Martinez. We'd been riding together for about 3 years by then, and I trusted her with my life. Sarah was tough as nails, but had this maternal instinct that made her great with kids and domestic situations. That night started like any other. We just grabbed some coffee and donuts from Murphy's Diner on 8th Street, planning to eat in the patrol car since it seemed like a quiet evening. But quiet nights in Detroit have a way of turning upside down real fast. Around 11:15, our radio crackled to life with an emergency dispatch. We were needed immediately at a house on Maple Grove, just a few blocks from where we were parked. The dispatcher's voice was strained, apparently. The woman who'd called 911 was hysterical, sobbing so hard that the operator could barely understand her. All they could make out was something about her nephew being badly hurt and needing both police and an ambulance right away. The November wind was howling that night, and thick storm clouds were rolling in from Lake Huron. You could feel the electricity in the air, like nature itself was holding its breath for something terrible to happen. We hit the sirens and raced through the empty streets, Sarah gripping the wheel while I tried to prepare myself for whatever we might find. We pulled up to a modest 2-story house with peeling paint and overgrown hedges. The porch light was flickering, casting eerie shadows across the front yard. We were the first responders on scene, which meant whatever was inside that house, we'd be facing it alone until backup arrived. Sarah knocked on the door, announcing ourselves as police officers. The door flew open almost immediately, revealing a woman in her mid-30s with wild, unkempt hair and tear-streaked cheeks. Her white sweater and jeans were stained with something dark that made my stomach clench. She was shaking violently, pointing toward the living room while stammering, "Please, you have to help him. You have to help my nephew." We rushed inside and immediately saw a little boy, maybe 7 years old, lying motionless on the hardwood floor. Without going into details out of respect for the child, I'll just say the scene was beyond disturbing. It was the kind of thing that makes seasoned cops consider early retirement. The ambulance sirens were already wailing in the distance as we tried to make sense of what we were seeing. While the paramedics worked frantically on the boy, Sarah and I questioned the woman, trying to piece together what had happened. Between her sobs, she managed to tell us that her name was Linda Morrison, and she was the aunt of 2 children whose mother worked night shifts at the Ford plant. Linda was supposed to babysit them that evening, but when she'd arrived at the house around 10:30, she'd walked into a nightmare that defied all logic. She found her 11-year-old niece standing over her little brother with a large kitchen knife in her hands. But what terrified Linda most wasn't just what the girl was doing. It was the look on her face. Linda kept repeating, "She wasn't herself. She wasn't my sweet Emma anymore." Her eyes were completely black, and she was smiling this horrible, twisted smile like she was enjoying every second of it. Linda said she'd screamed at Emma, demanding to know what she was doing, but the girl had just turned to look at her with that same demonic expression. Then, according to Linda, something strange happened. Emma suddenly looked down at her brother as if seeing him for the first time, and her face completely changed. The black left her eyes, replaced by confusion and terror. She dropped the knife and run upstairs to her bedroom, locking herself inside. The paramedics confirmed what we already suspected. The little boy, Tommy, hadn't made it. Linda collapsed into hysterical sobs while Sarah held her. and I felt that sick feeling in my gut that comes with cases involving children. Now we had to go upstairs and confront an 11-year-old girl who had apparently committed an unspeakable act. Sarah and I climbed the narrow staircase, our flashlights cutting through the darkness since most of the upstairs lights were burned out. We found Emma's room at the end of the hallway, the door locked from the inside. Sarah knocked gently, using her softest voice to try to coax the girl out. "Emma, honey, it's the police. We just want to talk to you. You're not in trouble, we just need to make sure you're okay." But there was no response, not even the sound of movement from inside the room. We tried to jimmy the lock rather than breaking down the door. The last thing we wanted was to traumatize the child further. But as we worked on the doorknob, we heard something that made our blood run cold. Laughter was coming from inside the room, but it wasn't the giggle of an 11-year-old girl. It was a deep, guttural chuckle that sounded like it came from a grown man or something worse. The laugh echoed off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Maybe someone else was in there with Emma. Maybe she was being held hostage by whoever had really hurt Tommy. We stopped trying to pick the lock and put our shoulders to the door, breaking it open in one swift motion. The room was small and cramped, filled with typical little girl things, stuffed animals, pink bedsheets, drawings taped to the walls. But Emma was sitting in the corner beneath her hanging clothes, staring directly at us with an expression that no child should ever have. Her smile was wide and predatory, and her eyes held a darkness that seemed ancient and evil. Sarah approached her carefully, asking if she was hurt or if anyone else had been in the room with her. But Emma just kept staring at us with that terrible smile, not saying a word. I searched every inch of that tiny room, under the bed, in the closet, behind the dresser. There was nowhere for an adult to hide, no radio or TV that could have produced that masculine laughter we'd heard. The single window had bars on it, and it was a straight drop to the concrete below. Emma was alone in that room, which meant that inhuman laughter had come from her. When Sarah tried to approach her, Emma suddenly lunged forward with surprising strength, screaming and clawing like a wild animal. It took both of us to restrain her, and I'll never forget the feeling of her small hands trying to scratch at our faces, while she made sounds that belonged in a horror movie, not a child's bedroom. We found the knife under a pile of clothes in her closet, still stained with her brother's blood. Emma's own clothes and hands were covered in evidence of what she'd done. During the interrogation that followed, Emma confessed to everything, but her explanation chilled everyone in the room. She kept insisting, "He made me do it. He told me I had to hurt Tommy or something worse would happen to all of us." The psychiatric evaluation showed Emma to be completely mentally healthy. No signs of abuse, no psychological disorders, no history of violence or behavioral problems. She was a normal 11-year-old girl who somehow had committed an unthinkable act. The investigation revealed that Emma and Tommy's mother, Patricia, had recently started dating a man named Marcus Webb, who claimed to be some kind of spiritual advisor. Neighbors reported seeing strange people coming and going from the house at all hours, and Patricia later admitted that Marcus had convinced her to participate in occult rituals in exchange for wealth and success. Emma's behavior had changed dramatically after Marcus entered their lives. She'd become aggressive, started using profanity, and Linda had caught her multiple times having conversations with invisible people in her room. Strange things had been happening in the house, two dishes flying off shelves in the middle of the night, unexplained sounds and voices when no one else was home. When police searched the house, they found books on demonology and witchcraft hidden throughout, along with several handmade ritualistic objects that Marcus had left behind before disappearing. Emma was placed in juvenile custody, and Patricia was released on bail. The case officially remained unsolved, though Sarah and I knew exactly what we'd witnessed that night. Sometimes there are things in this world that can't be explained by psychology textbooks or criminal profiles. I retired from the force 5 years later, but I still wake up sometimes thinking about Emma's smile and that terrible laughter echoing from an empty room. Whatever happened in that house, whatever Marcus Webb brought into those children's lives, it was something beyond human understanding. And sometimes, late at night when the wind howls like it did that November evening, I wonder if Emma ever really came back from wherever that darkness took her. My name is David Patterson, and I spent 15 years patrolling the streets of Portland, Oregon, before transferring to the detective division. This incident happened back in March of 2003, during one of those cold, rainy Pacific Northwest nights that seem to seep into your bones and stay there. I was working the graveyard shift with my partner Jake Morrison. We'd been partners for about 2 years, and Jake was one of those cops who'd seen everything twice and wasn't easily rattled. That night, we were cruising through the Burnside district around 2 in the morning when our radio burst to life with an urgent call. Multiple residents on Cherry Street were reporting disturbing screams coming from an abandoned house that had been empty for nearly 3 years. The dispatcher said the callers were terrified. They described the sounds as blood-curdling and inhuman, like someone was being tortured inside the boarded-up property. Jake hit the gas, and we raced through the empty streets, windshield wipers fighting against the steady downpour. Cherry Street was lined with modest craftsman houses from the 1920s, most well-maintained except for the one at the end of the block that stood out like a rotting tooth. When we arrived, there were at least a dozen neighbors standing in the street despite the rain, most wearing bathrobes and slippers. They all looked shaken, pointing toward the deteriorating 2-story house with its broken windows and sagging front porch. The place had been condemned after a fire damaged the interior, and it had been sitting empty ever since, while the city and the bank fought over who was responsible for demolition. An elderly man named Harold Chen approached us immediately. He was the one who'd made the initial call, and his hands were shaking as he spoke. "Officers, I've lived on this street for 37 years, and I've never heard anything like what's coming from that house tonight. It started around 1:15 screaming, like someone was being murdered in there. Before we could respond, another horrible shriek echoed from inside the abandoned building. It was definitely a woman's voice, filled with such agony and terror that it made several of the neighbors step back toward their own homes. The sound seemed to pierce right through the rain and wind, carrying a desperation that made my skin crawl. Jake and I told everyone to get back inside their houses and lock their doors. If we had to discharge our weapons, we didn't want any civilians in the line of fire. Most complied, though I could see faces pressed against windows up and down the street. We approached the front door, which was hanging askew on its hinges. Years of weather damage had warped the wood, and it looked like it would fall apart if you breathed on it too hard. Jake called out in his authoritative voice, "Portland Police. If anyone's in there, come out with your hands visible. We're coming in." No response, except for another agonized scream from somewhere inside. Jake kicked the door, and it practically disintegrated, crashing to the floor in a cloud of dust and splinters. We entered with our flashlights and weapons drawn, the beams cutting through the darkness to reveal a scene of complete abandonment. The first floor was littered with debris, old furniture covered in mildew, fast food containers left by squatters, graffiti covering most of the walls. The smell was overwhelming mold decay, and something else that reminded me of a morgue. We cleared the downstairs room by room, finding nothing but trash and evidence of drug use. But as we stood at the bottom of the staircase, we heard it again, that same dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor above us. The screaming had stopped, but somehow the silence was even more unsettling. Jake and I climbed the stairs slowly, testing each step to make sure the rotted wood would hold our weight. The second floor was just as empty as the first, but when we reached what had once been the master bedroom, we found something that made both of us stop cold. Someone had carved a massive pentagram into the hardwood floor, at least 6 feet across. The lines were deep and deliberate, gouged into the wood with something sharp. Around the pentagram were symbols that neither of us recognized, though they looked vaguely Middle Eastern or ancient in origin. But what really got our attention was what appeared to be writing on the walls, words and phrases in a language I'd never seen before. All of it written in what looked like dried blood mixed with human waste. The smell in that room was so bad that Jake had to step outside to keep from vomiting. I've been to plenty of crime scenes, but this was different. This felt wrong, like the very air in that room was poisoned. We secured the scene and called for backup, then began interviewing the neighbors more thoroughly. According to Harold Chen and several others, the house had been quiet for months until about 3 weeks ago, when people started noticing shadowy figures climbing through the broken windows late at night. No one had called the police then, because they assumed it was just homeless people looking for shelter. But Harold's wife, Margaret, had a different story. She told us that she'd been having trouble sleeping lately and had been sitting by her bedroom window around midnight when she saw 3 men in dark clothing approach the abandoned house. They were carrying what looked like bags or satchels, and they entered through a side window that had been completely boarded up. They didn't look like homeless people, Margaret insisted. They moved with purpose, like they knew exactly what they were doing. And officer, I swear I could hear them chanting something, not in English, but in some other language that sounded ancient and evil. Other neighbors confirmed seeing similar groups of people entering the house over the past few weeks, always in the early morning hours, always carrying bags or packages. Everyone agreed that whatever was happening in there, it wasn't good. We spent the rest of the night taking statements and securing the scene, but we never found any explanation for those terrible screams. The forensics team found no evidence of recent violence, no blood except for what was on the walls, no signs that anyone had been harmed inside the house that night. My theory, which I kept to myself since it would never hold up in court, was that we'd witnessed some kind of demonic manifestation. The pentagram, the the ritualistic symbols, the testimonies about groups of people conducting ceremonies. It all pointed to occult activity that had apparently summoned something into that house. The city fast-tracked the demolition after our report was filed. Within 2 weeks, the entire structure was reduced to rubble and hauled away. The lot sat empty for years before finally being developed into a small park. Jake and I never talked much about what we experienced that night, but I know it affected him too. He transferred to day shift within 6 months and eventually left the force altogether to become a security consultant. As for me, I developed a healthy respect for things that can't be explained by conventional logic. Sometimes, when I'm driving through that neighborhood and pass by the little park that now occupies that corner lot, I remember those screams echoing through the rain-soaked darkness. And I wonder if whatever those ritualists summoned that night ever really left, or if it's still there somehow, waiting for the right conditions to make itself known again. The official report classified the incident as unfounded, but those of us who were there that night know better. Some things exist beyond the reach of police reports and rational explanations, and sometimes the most terrifying cases are the ones that never get solved. I've been retired from the Phoenix Police Department for 8 years now, but there's one case from my 30-year career that I've never been able to forget. It happened in September of 2007, during one of those desert nights when the temperature finally drops below 90 degrees, and you can actually think clearly. I was working the night desk at the Maryvale precinct when we received what initially seemed like a routine domestic disturbance call. The voice on the other end of the line was small and frightened, clearly a young child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. She spoke in whispers, like she was afraid someone might overhear her. "Please help my brother," she said. "Mommy and Daddy are hurting him again, and I don't know what to do. He's crying and there's blood, and I'm scared they're going to kill him this time." The address she gave us was in a rundown neighborhood where we responded to domestic calls at least twice a week. I dispatched officers Maria Santos and Tom Bradley to investigate, figuring it was another case of parents who'd lost control and taken their frustrations out on their kids. Maria and Tom arrived at a small adobe house with a dead front lawn and broken toys scattered across the dirt yard. The place looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years: peeling paint, cracked windows, and a front door that was barely hanging on its hinges. When they knocked, a heavy-set man in his 40s answered, opening the door just wide enough to see out, but not enough for the officers to see inside. Maria explained that they'd received a call about a child in distress at this address, and they needed to come inside to make sure everyone was safe. The man immediately became defensive and hostile. "Ain't no kids calling nobody from here," he said. "You got the wrong house." But Maria and Tom had been doing this long enough to recognize the signs. The man was nervous, sweating despite the cool evening air, and kept glancing back into the house like he was worried about something. When they insisted on entering to conduct a welfare check, he finally stepped aside, but you could tell he wasn't happy about it. Inside, they found a woman sitting on a stained couch, staring at a television with the volume turned down low. She barely acknowledged the officer's presence, just nodded when they asked if she lived there. The man identified himself as Robert Hendricks, and the woman was his wife Carol. They had one son, he said, 8-year-old Danny. What about your daughter? Maria asked, remembering the little girl who'd made the call. Robert and Carol exchanged a look that Maria later described as pure guilt. We don't have a daughter, Carol finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Our little girl Emma, she passed away 3 months ago. Pneumonia. We couldn't afford to take her to the doctor until it was too late. Maria felt that familiar knot form in her stomach, the one that always appeared when she was dealing with child abuse cases. She asked to see Danny, and Robert reluctantly led them to a small bedroom at the back of the house. What they found there was heartbreaking. Danny was lying on a mattress on the floor, covered in bruises that were in various stages of healing. His left arm was clearly broken, and he had what looked like cigarette burns on his back and chest. The little boy was conscious, but barely responsive, probably from pain and fear. The paramedics were called immediately, and Robert and Carol Hendricks were arrested on charges of child abuse and neglect. Danny was taken to Phoenix Children's Hospital, where doctors confirmed that he'd been systematically abused for months, possibly years. But here's where the story gets strange. During the investigation that followed, Maria and Tom confirmed that the Hendricks family had indeed lost a daughter 3 months earlier. Emma Hendricks, age 6, had died of complications from pneumonia after her parents failed to seek medical treatment. She'd been buried in a pauper's grave at Mountain View Cemetery because the family couldn't afford a proper funeral. The call that brought us to that house had come from a 6-year-old girl asking for help for her brother. The voice matched Emma's age exactly, and she'd given the correct address and described the abuse situation accurately. But Emma Hendricks had been dead for 3 months when that call was made. I personally reviewed the recorded 911 call multiple times. The voice was clear and distinct, definitely a young child, speaking with the vocabulary and speech patterns of a 6-year-old. She knew details about the house layout, the family situation, and Danny's condition that no one else could have known. The phone company confirmed that the call had originated from inside the Hendricks house, from a landline phone in the living room. But both Robert and Carol insisted that Danny was barely conscious at the time and couldn't have made the call himself. And even if he could have, how would he have disguised his voice to sound like a little girl? We investigated every possibility. Maybe a neighbor child had somehow gotten into the house. Maybe there was some kind of technical glitch that altered the voice on the recording. Maybe the parents were lying about Emma's death. But every lead came up empty. Emma Hendricks was definitely dead and buried. The death certificate was legitimate, signed by the county coroner. The funeral home had records of her burial. There was no other child in that house who could have made that call. The case went to trial, and Robert and Carol Hendricks were both convicted of child abuse and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Danny was placed in foster care and eventually adopted by a loving family who got him the medical and psychological help he needed. But I kept a copy of that 911 recording in my personal files. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd listen to it again, trying to find some rational explanation for what had happened. The little girl's voice was so clear, so urgent. Please help my brother. Mommy and Daddy are hurting him again. And then, just before hanging up, she'd said something that still gives me chills. Tell Danny that Emma is watching over him and everything is going to be okay now. I never told Danny about that final message. He was just a traumatized 8-year-old who needed to heal and move forward with his life. But I like to think that somehow, somewhere, his big sister Emma kept her promise to watch over him. In 30 years of police work, I've seen a lot of things that defied explanation. But that case taught me that sometimes the most important mysteries aren't the ones we solve. They're the ones that remind us there are forces in this world beyond our understanding. Forces that occasionally intervene when innocent children need protection the most. The official report listed the source of the emergency call as unknown, but those of us who worked the case knew the truth. Sometimes the dead don't rest easy when the living are in danger, and sometimes love is stronger than death itself. I'm a state trooper for the California Highway Patrol, working the night shift on Interstate 5 between Los Angeles and San Diego. My family came here from Mexico when I was just a kid, but I was born in California and consider this state my home. I've been patrolling these highways for 12 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything there was to see on the midnight roads. That all changed one foggy October night in 2019. I was running radar near the Oceanside exit around 2 in the morning when I noticed a dark blue SUV traveling northbound at a reasonable speed. Nothing suspicious about the vehicle itself. It was a newer model Chevy Tahoe with what appeared to be a family inside. But as it passed under the overhead lights, I caught sight of something that made me do a double take. There was a small hand pressed against the rear window, and it was waving at me. Now, this isn't entirely unusual. Kids wave at police cars all the time, even in the middle of the night. But something about this particular wave bothered me. The hand was so small, clearly belonging to a very young child, and it seemed urgent somehow. Not the casual wave of a kid who sees a cop car, but more like someone trying to get my attention. I decided to follow the SUV for a few miles to make sure everything was legitimate. California has strict laws about child safety. Kids have to be in proper car seats or booster seats depending on their age, and they definitely can't be riding unsecured in the cargo area of an SUV. As I pulled in behind the Tahoe, I got a better look at the situation. The rear window was tinted, but with my patrol car's high-intensity lights, I could make out the silhouette of what appeared to be a small boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old. He was definitely in the cargo area behind the back seats, and he continued waving at me as we drove down the highway. I waved back. I always try to be friendly with kids, but I knew I needed to pull this vehicle over. Having a small child unsecured in the back of an SUV is dangerous and illegal, regardless of the family's intentions. I activated my overhead lights and chirped the siren once to signal the driver to pull over. The SUV immediately complied, pulling onto the shoulder and coming to a complete stop. I positioned my patrol car behind them with my lights still flashing, then approached the driver's side window. The driver was a middle-aged Caucasian man, probably in his 40s, wearing a polo shirt and looking like he'd been driving for hours. His passenger was a woman of similar age, presumably his wife. Both seemed confused but cooperative when I explained why I'd stopped them. "Officer, is there a problem?" the man asked, rolling down his window completely. "I noticed you have a young child riding unsecured in your cargo area," I said, gesturing toward the back of the SUV. California law requires all children to be properly restrained in appropriate safety seats. The man and woman exchanged a puzzled look. "Officer, I'm not sure what you mean," the woman said. "There's nobody else in the car with us. It's just my husband and me." I looked toward the rear window, but the tinted glass made it impossible to see clearly from this angle. "Sir, I'm going to need you both to step out of the vehicle so I can take a look inside," I said, maintaining my professional tone but feeling increasingly confused. They complied without argument, standing beside their SUV, while I opened the rear hatch and examined the cargo area. I checked behind the back seats, under floor mats, even opened up the spare tire compartment. The entire interior of the vehicle was empty, except for a few pieces of luggage and some snacks for their road trip. There was no child anywhere in that SUV. I searched thoroughly, even asking them to fold down the rear seats so I could check every possible hiding spot. Nothing. It was just a middle-aged couple driving home from a weekend in San Diego, exactly as they'd told me. "I apologize for the inconvenience," I said, feeling genuinely confused. "I could have sworn I saw a small child waving from your rear window. Maybe it was shadows from the overhead lights or something." That's when the woman's expression changed. She got very quiet for a moment, then said something that sent chills down my spine. "Officer, this SUV used to belong to my sister and her family. Her little boy, Joshua, was killed in this car 2 years ago. He had a heart condition, and they were rushing him to the children's hospital when he went into cardiac arrest in the back seat. They didn't make it in time." Her husband looked uncomfortable with her sharing this information, clearly skeptical of anything supernatural. "Honey, please don't," he said. "The officer doesn't need to hear about that." But the woman continued. "Joshua was 4 years old, and he always sat in the back seat waving at police cars and fire trucks. It was his favorite thing to do. After he died, my sister couldn't bear to keep the car, so she sold it to us at a huge discount. We probably should have told you that the car had a history." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms despite the warm October night. "Ma'am, can you describe what Joshua looked like?" He was small for his age, with light brown hair and the biggest smile you've ever seen. He was wearing his favorite blue shirt when it happened. He was always trying to get people's attention, always waving and making friends with strangers. The description matched exactly what I'd seen in my patrol car's lights. A small boy in the cargo area, waving enthusiastically at my police car. I let them go with another apology, but I couldn't shake what had happened. The next day, I requested the dash cam footage from my patrol car, hoping to review what I'd seen and maybe find some rational explanation. The footage was clear as day. There, in the rear window of that blue Tahoe, was the unmistakable silhouette of a small child waving at my patrol car. You could see the outline of his head, his small arm moving back and forth, even the shape of what looked like a child's shirt. The image was captured from multiple angles as I followed the SUV down the highway. But when I searched that vehicle an hour later, it was completely empty. I've watched that footage dozens of times over the past few years, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was shadows. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by the way light reflected off the tinted windows. But deep down, I know what I saw that night. I think Joshua was still riding in the back of that SUV, the same way he had when he was alive. And maybe, just maybe, He was trying to wave goodbye to one more police officer before finally moving on to wherever little children go when their time on Earth is finished. I never saw the SUV again on my patrol route, and I often wonder if Joshua's parents ever experienced anything similar. Some things in this job you learn not to question too deeply. You just file them away in that part of your mind reserved for the unexplainable and keep doing your job. But every time I see a child waving at me from a passing car, I wave back. Because you never know when it might be someone who really needs to know that they've been seen, that they matter, and that they're not forgotten. I've kept this story to myself for years, bound by department policy never to discuss what happens on the job. But what I witnessed that November night in rural Pennsylvania still haunts me, and I can't take it to my grave without sharing it. I was a rookie cop then, barely 2 years on the force in a small town outside Pittsburgh. My partner Jake and I were working the midnight shift, cruising through the quiet residential areas that made up our beat. It had been an unusually calm evening, just a few domestic disturbance calls and one drunk driver. Nothing that prepared us for what was coming. The temperature had dropped to near freezing that night, and a thick fog rolled in from the river valley, creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed to cling to everything. Street lights became dim halos in the mist, and visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. Something about that fog felt wrong, like it was hiding things that shouldn't be seen. Around 12:45 in the morning, dispatch crackled through our radio. A young girl had called 911 from a house on Maple Street, saying her mother needed help but couldn't explain what was wrong. The dispatcher said the child sounded terrified and kept mentioning strange noises coming from upstairs. We responded immediately, our patrol car cutting through the fog-shrouded streets. The house was a modest 2-story colonial with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. Most of the windows were dark, except for a faint light flickering in what appeared to be a second-floor bedroom. The front door opened before we could knock. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, stood there in her pajamas. Her face was streaked with tears, and her small hands were shaking. I knelt down to her level and asked what was wrong with her mommy. "She's locked in her room," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's screaming really bad, and there's someone else up there with her. Someone who shouldn't be there." Jake and I exchanged glances. We assumed it was a break-in, possibly a domestic violence situation. We told the girl to stay downstairs and drew our weapons as we climbed the narrow staircase. The old wooden steps creaked under our boots, each sound seeming unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. As we reached the top of the stairs, we heard it violent banging against the walls, like someone was being thrown around the room. A woman's voice screamed desperately, "Leave me alone. Please, just go away." The terror in her voice was unlike anything I'd heard before or since. We identified ourselves as police officers and demanded that whoever was in the room open the door immediately. The banging stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Jake positioned himself to kick in the door while I aimed my weapon, ready for whatever we might find. The bedroom door burst open, and we rushed inside expecting to confront an intruder. Instead, we found a woman huddled in the corner, alone. Her hair was disheveled, her nightgown torn, and her eyes held a look of absolute terror that I'll never forget. She was hyperventilating, pressing herself against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Where's the person who was attacking you?" I asked, scanning the room. Jake searched everywhere, under the bed, in the closet, behind the dresser. The window was painted shut and hadn't been opened in years. There was no other way out of that room, yet she had clearly been fighting with someone. The woman looked at us with those haunted eyes and whispered, "You have to leave. Now, before it comes back for all of us." We tried to calm her down, explaining that she and her daughter were safe now, that we would protect them. But she became increasingly agitated, insisting that we didn't understand what we were dealing with. She kept repeating that we had made things worse by coming here, that he would be angry about the interference. That's when we heard the front door slam shut with tremendous force, followed by the little girl's scream from downstairs. We raced down to find her cowering under the dining room table, sobbing uncontrollably. I tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something massive was pressing against it from the outside, holding it closed with inhuman strength. The woman appeared at the top of the stairs, her face white with terror. "I told you," she screamed. "Now he's here, and we're all going to pay for what you've done." I demanded to know who she was talking about, and her answer chilled me to the bone. The devil himself. Jake and I looked at each other skeptically. We dealt with mentally ill people before, drug addicts who saw things that weren't there. But then the lights began to flicker, and the temperature in the house seemed to drop 20 degrees in seconds. The family dog in the backyard started howling like it was being tortured. And that's when we heard the footsteps. They were coming down the stairs, but they weren't human footsteps. They sounded heavy and uneven, like hooves on hardwood. The woman began screaming and covering her ears, while the little girl cried harder under the table. We aimed our weapons at the staircase and shouted warnings, but no one answered. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, each one echoing through the house like a death knell. As police officers, we're trained never to show fear, never to run from danger. But I swear, in that moment, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of that house. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my gun steady. I faced armed criminals, domestic abusers, and drug dealers, but nothing had ever terrified me like those approaching footsteps. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The woman was standing near the bottom of the stairs when something grabbed her ankles and yanked her upward with incredible force. She tumbled backward, her head bouncing off each step as whatever had her dragged her toward the second floor. Jake fired a warning shot into the ceiling out of pure shock, and I lunged forward trying to grab her hands, but she was pulled away too quickly. We chased after her, but by the time we reached the top of the stairs, the bedroom door was already locked. The sounds coming from inside that room were inhuman, not just the woman's agonized screams, but growling and snarling like some massive predator. The walls shook with the force of whatever was happening in there. Jake shot the lock off the door, but it still wouldn't open. We threw our shoulders against it, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Something on the other side was holding it shut with strength that defied physics. The lights went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness except for our flashlights. I tried to radio for backup, but static was all I got. That's when the horrible truth hit us both. We weren't dealing with anything human, anything our training had prepared us for. Our weapons, our authority, our backup, none of it mattered against whatever force we'd encountered. While Jake continued trying to break down the door, I ran downstairs to check on the little girl. She wasn't under the table anymore. I searched frantically with my flashlight, calling her name, until I found her standing motionless in the kitchen doorway. But something was wrong. She wasn't crying anymore. Instead, she wore a smile that no child should ever have, cold, knowing, and utterly malevolent. She stared at me without blinking, and I felt ice water flow through my veins. The innocent little girl who had answered the door was gone, replaced by something wearing her face like a mask. I called for Jake, and he came running down the stairs. He started to approach the girl, but I grabbed his arm and shook my head. I couldn't explain how I knew, but that thing standing in our kitchen doorway wasn't the child we'd come to help. The malevolent energy radiating from her small form was almost suffocating. We backed away slowly, trying to reach the front door, but the girl began walking toward us with that same terrible smile. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her eyes never left ours. When we reached the door, Jake shot at the lock again, but it made no difference. We were trapped. The girl stopped at the foot of the stairs and stood perfectly still. Then we heard those hoofed footsteps again, descending slowly. In the weak beam of our flashlights, we saw something that will haunt me until the day I die. A hand that looked more like a bird's talon reached down and took the girl's hand, leading her back upstairs into the darkness. Suddenly, the front door swung open on its own. We didn't hesitate. We ran to our patrol car and called for backup immediately. Within 10 minutes, 2 more units arrived, and the house's electricity mysteriously came back on. We told our fellow officers everything, and they entered the house to investigate. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. Over the radio, I heard one of them report finding a woman's body in the upstairs bedroom. There was no sign of the little girl anywhere. I broke down crying right there in the street, knowing that we had witnessed something take that innocent child into whatever hell existed beyond our understanding. She was never found, despite extensive searches and investigations that continued for months. In the days that followed, we learned more about the family from the girl's father, who lived in another state with his new wife. He told us that his ex-wife had fallen in with a dangerous crowd in the months before their divorce. People who practiced dark rituals and claimed they could summon supernatural forces to grant worldly desires. According to him, she had become obsessed with escaping their financial struggles and had been given a Ouija board and other occult items by her new friends. They convinced her that she could make a pact with dark forces to change her circumstances. He tried to get custody of his daughter, but the courts had ruled in his ex-wife's favor. He was convinced that his ex-wife's dabbling in the occult had invited something evil into their home, something that eventually demanded payment for whatever promises it had made. In the end, it took the thing she loved most, their daughter. Years have passed since that night, but I still wake up sometimes hearing those hoofsteps on the stairs. I've tried to find rational explanations for what happened, but deep down, I know that some doors should never be opened, and some bargains should never be made. The case officially remains unsolved, listed as a missing person investigation. But those of us who were there that night know the truth. That little girl didn't just disappear. She was taken by something that exists in the spaces between our world and darker realms. Payment for her mother's desperate attempts to change their lives through supernatural means. I still patrol these streets, but I've never forgotten that sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones we can arrest and put in jail. Sometimes they're the ones we invite in ourselves, and by the time we realize our mistake, it's already too late. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.